What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like it in Magic, and you read the title right. Today we are, in fact, going to take the time to rank every single card in Theros Beyond Death for sealed play. Whether you're playing in the pre-release this weekend or you want to play some sealed on Arena this season, I got you back. So if you enjoyed the video and it helps you out in any way, then make sure you go down there and hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel for more decks, because decks start this weekend, and consider pledging to the channel on Patreon if you want to support this content and help choose what decks we do on the channel in the first place. But I wanted to keep the intro short because we've obviously got a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, so as the goose said, let's get down to it, everyone. Rating every single card in Theros Beyond Death for sealed play from 0 to 5. Starting with the white cards, moving on from there, and the first thing you may have noticed, quick note, is that I've greatly zoomed in my screen since the last time I did a video like this. And that's because some of you told me you can't read the cards on your phone because they're too small, or there's too many cards on screen at the same time. So this was the most efficient way I could think to remedy that situation. Let me know how you feel about it. There's going to be 3 cards on screen for the majority of the video at a time. So let me know if that works for you. I'll try to find another workaround for it. But in any case, let's go ahead and get started with the white cards. You may notice that every card on your screen right now looks like a ridiculous bomb. I think that in sealed, Helios is the least bomby of the 3 cards on your screen, but it's still a pretty righteous card that's going to win you a lot of long games. It's really difficult to beat in combat, especially if you are able to both turn it on either or activate it as well. Just a great mana sink. It's going to win you a lot of games against more aggressive decks. So I will say 5 Devotion is a little bit harder to turn on in sealed than you might think, but this doesn't necessarily have to be turned on. Do a lot of work for you, and again, be a really good grindy long game piece for you. So I'm going to give it a 3.5 to start our ratings. As far as Elspeth's Son's Nemesis, this I really like. I want to give this card a 4 just off the rip because, yeah, it doesn't have any plus abilities, but the ability to come back at least once, if not sometimes twice, in some sealed games, although probably few and far between. Just being able to bring this back once is great because it's going to give you up to, what, 8 tokens on the battlefield. That's a huge board presence. Sometimes it's going to let you swing for an awful lot. So all of the abilities on this are good. If you need to catch up against an aggressive deck, this lets you do that too in terms of gaining life or, again, gaining board presence. So just about everything this card does is something you want to do, and it's decent whether you're ahead or behind. And again, the ability to come back from the dead is just really delicious, sweet, rich gravy. So I like this card an awful lot in sealed, and I like it in standard too, but it doesn't mean it's not a good sealed card. Again, I'll give it at least a 4 to start off. Now, Archon of Sun's Grace, one of my favorite cards in the set, low-key, one of the ones I'm most excited to actually start messing around with. But in sealed, I got to give this a really high score too. I'm going to give this the same score as Elspeth. I'll give it a 4 because sometimes it's just going to be a 4-mana 3/4 flying lifelink. Turns out in sealed, though, those are perfectly acceptable stats and amazing keywords. So even if it never makes you another body, it's a pretty good play and you want it in your deck. You definitely play it if you open it, but if you can make even 1 body off of this, God forbid 2, 3, 4, it just becomes ludicrous, and it's one of the more bomby cards in the set if you can support it with a lot of enchantments. So I really like this, and I'll start things off by giving this a 4 as well. Now let's move on to Eidolon of Obstruction and Elspeth Conquers Death on your screen here. Eidolon of Obstruction, I'm just going to give a 2.5 because I like it as a 2-mana 2/1 first strike. Those are very good abilities. I like Bears in Limited, just 2-mana 2-power creatures, but I especially like when they have first strike because they're almost always going to beat other 2-mana creatures in combat. Very important thing to remember. First strike is great down here at the curb on a pretty decently statted creature. So I like this an awful lot, mostly just because of the first strike. If you ever get incidental value off of it, that's great, but that's not really what's good about the card. It's one of the better curve fillers at the lower end of the curve in the entire set. And this is a set with some really good 2-drops, but this beats a whole lot of them in combat simply given the first strike. So we'll give it a 2.5. Elspeth Conquers Death, one of the biggest white bombs, in my opinion, in the entire set. If not, the absolute best card in white in the set, just because this does so much for you. Not only would you play a 5-mana piece of removal that exiles whatever you want to, and of course this doesn't exile whatever you want to, but it's almost always going to exile the most important permanent on the battlefield at the time, the biggest problem card that you're facing at the time. So the first chapter is already amazing, and you'd play that regardless. I actually don't mind the second chapter, although obviously, whoops, there's my news. Don't mind the I don't even know what those stories were, but anyway, obviously the first chapter is like good enough on the card, but doesn't make it worth playing by itself. The second chapter is actually really good in some situations, but obviously it's not always going to be decent. The third chapter, however, is incredible. So just the first and third chapters on this make me think that it's one of the best cards for sealed play in the entire set, and I want to give this a 4.5 to start things off here. Now, I know that sometimes this won't do anything if you don't have a creature or planeswalker in your yard, but very often you're going to have a creature or planeswalker in your yard by turn like 7 or more when this does go off. So it's always going to give you two of the best kinds of value you can get in sealed. That's reanimation and removal. So and exile removal at that. So I just love everything about this card right here. So I'm going to give it a 4.5. I think it might be one of the best white cards. But I'm moving on to All Seed of Life's Bounty. We've moved down to All Seed, Tyrannica, and Shattered the Sky here. But I'll start with All Seed, which I want to give a 2, but honestly in a lot of decks it might be closer to a 2.5, to be honest. I don't usually love 1-drops in sealed, but this does so much for you, even in the mid and late game, that I'm a big fan of it. Sometimes it's just going to be effectively a 2-mana protection spell. You know, you rip it off the top of your library on turn 7 or 8. The fact that it's just a creature on the board is decent, but not great considering it's just a 1-mana, 1/1 lifelink. But the ability to pump another mana into it is always going to be really effective at any point in the game, whether you're trying to get a creature through for combat damage, or whether you're trying to beat your opponent in combat when they swing in. It's just always going to be impactful to have a creature that can do this for another one of your creatures. So big fan of this, and even though I'm not a huge stan for 1-mana creatures in limited, they have to be very good, I will at least give this a 2 if nothing else. But moving on to Tyrannica here, I actually think this is great. 3-mana 3/3 vigilance are decent stats right there, but the ability to turn, that 1-mana 1/1, an All Seed, into a 4/4, that still has the lifelink, by the way, and now indestructible. That's always really good. And I don't think there's going to be any shortage of 1- and 2-mana creatures you can play to follow up Tyrannica with. So I like this card a lot just based on stats alone, but if it has even one creature to work with in these aggressive decks, it's going to be fantastic. So sorry for bumping my mic, but I'm going to give Tyrannica at least a 3. Honestly, I think this is a very, very strong card that goes in your deck regardless. But if you're playing a bunch of creatures and if you're especially aggressive, it's a really powerful card. But let's move on to, well, I don't want to move the cursor yet, sorry. Let's move on to Shatter the Sky. This is just a 4-mana Wrath, so it's at least a 4. Period. If not a 4.5, even though your opponent will occasionally, but not always, draw a card off of it, the ability to clear the board for 4 mana is always going to be amazing. So even though they might, but again, not always, but they might draw a card, I still think that it's going, this is main deckable in all but the most aggressive decks as kind of a panic button. And in control decks, it's going to be one of the best cards in the deck. So at least a 4 for Shatter. But moving on to Idyllic Tutor and Helios Intervention. I think these are both relatively strong cards for sealed as well, but Idyllic Tutor I'll just give a 2.5 because it's going to you have to have a very specific enchantment in mind. But that said, you're probably going to play a fairly high density of enchantments in this set because the set's based around enchantments. So you should always have something to tutor up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have something amazing to tutor up that's worth skipping a turn or spending 3 mana on that you need to play on the next turn to win the game. There could be ways to go grab bomb enchantments from your deck or something, but for the most part, just stick with a 2.5, which is still a very good score, by the way. At least it's playable in the main deck if you have the right things to support it. Now, Helios Intervention, I also think is main deck playable because there's going to be a lot of enchantments in this format. So in sealed, you might be able to 2-for-1 your opponent fairly easily at instant speed with this. But even if you can't find good targets for it, you can still gain like 8 life pretty easily at the end of your opponent's turn with this. So it's also a good safety valve against these, aggressive decks. Even though I really wish it affected the board in some way when it gains you the life, it doesn't. But this will still often 2 or even 3-for-1 an opponent and even kill creatures an awful lot of the time in this particular environment. So I do think that this is a card that, you don't bench. You go ahead and put this on the team. So I like this, and I'd probably main deck it if I got one copy of it and was in white. But moving on to Archon of Falling Stars, as well as Banishing Light and Commanding Presence. I like all of these cards too. Archon of Falling Stars, I want to give a 3.5, but I want to bump it up to like a 4.5 because of the art, but that's not what we're here for. The art is amazing though. But anyway, the Flying Cow. I will give a 4-2 because a 4 mana, or excuse me, a 6 mana 4/4 flying is great stats and limited. You're going to play your air elementals every time you get them anyway, but when it comes to this card, it's often going to create value for you the moment it enters, or the moment it dies. So if your opponent does get rid of this probably problem permanent to them, then they're not necessarily completely, you know, out of it. They still have to deal with the enchantment that you bring back, and very often the enchantment you bring back is going to be a creature. So this is going to not only be a big flying body that threatens to end the game, but really good value if they do find a way of actually killing it. So big fan of Archon. I'll give it a 3.5. We'll stick with that. But on to Banishing Light, which I will give a 4. Now, I'm a little bit reserved about Banishing Light because I think that, just like the last time we were in Theros, any sort of enchantment destruction in Sealed is main deckable. So I think there's going to be a lot of ways people have to deal with Banishing Light. And especially if your opponent can kill your Banishing Light at instant speed, that can be a big problem in combat. Something you always have to worry about. You swing in, they destroy your Banishing Light, suddenly their creature pops back in. That can be a real headache. So do keep things like that in mind. But this is still a 3 mana unconditional removal spell against all kinds of stuff. Literally all kinds of stuff except for lands. So Banishing Light is always going to be playable in your Sealed deck, so I'll give it a 4. It's one of the best removal pieces in the set. Now, Commanding Presence, one of the best Auras in the set, to my mind. This makes creatures really, really difficult to beat in combat. First strike plus a big meaty boost like this is always really dope. Plus, whenever it does swing in and actually get through, you know, your opponent decides not to contest it because they can't beat it in combat. Well, if they let it through, you get more board presence to then block with when you say go, or just to build up your board presence. You know, there's a bunch of these heroic guys in this format that have, you know, whenever you target this guy with something, creatures you control get +1/+0. So any cards that make tokens are going to be really good with those heroic dudes. And Commanding Presence is one of the better auras for the sort of red-white auras deck that we're seeing, or green-white auras deck too, that we're seeing in the Sealed environment. It's going to be a popular archetype, and Commanding Presence is going to be one of the better and more lower rarity enchantments for that archetype. So I will give it a 3, even though I'm a little bit wary about auras as usual, and 4 mana is a lot to pay. I think this is one of the stronger auras in the format if you can stick it, so I'll give it a 3. Now moving on to Daxos and Don Evangel. I'll start with Daxos first here. I do like this card, but again, it's not especially super exciting, but this is another card that signals that aggressive decks might not be so great in this format. It's uncommon, so it's going to be fairly easy to get your hands on one. Really pays off devotion pretty well in the form of a creature that's hard to actually swing into and continues to gain life. I do like things about this card, especially the way it interacts with Heliod if you get that bomb. So there's some cool things about this, but it's a good creature by itself, even if you don't have a ton of synergy for it. But you're going to play creatures one way or the other, so just having a sort of Soul Warden on the battlefield is a pretty good upside to playing this card in the first place. But you could have said that about like Impassioned Orator, and it wasn't the best card in Sealed or anything last time around. So I don't love Daxos, but I do like it enough to give it a 3. I think it's one of the better 2-drops you can play in white, and that's pretty obvious. As far as Don Evangel, I want to give this a 3, but I'll give it a 2.5 because I think it's going to be a little bit tougher to pay off than you might think some of the time. Although if it only gets back one creature the entire game, I think it's definitely done its job. You know, it's gotten you some card advantage if it just gets back one thing that dies. And plus, note, this is going to work with some of the black auras that kill creatures to, you know, kill one of their guys and get you a dude back. If it ever does that, then it's really good. So if you do have the proper synergies and the proper combos for Don Evangel to really start popping off, this is going to be a good card, but some turns it's going to sit there and just be a 3-mana 2/3. And that's not going to be the best thing in the world most of the time because that stat line isn't particularly impressive by itself. So I'm going to give Don Evangel a 2.5. But again, if you can pop it off a lot, then it easily increases to a 3 or 3.5. But in terms of just in a vacuum, even with some of the synergies present in the set, I'm just going to stick at 2.5. But anyway, let's move on here to Faye Tactics, Laguna Band Storyteller, and Hero of the Winds. Starting with Faye Tactics here, I do really, really like this for the aggressive decks in Sealed. If you do choose to go the aggressive route, this is one of the better payoffs, I think, in terms of just winning the game outright. Especially, again, if you do have the heroic creatures, we see one in Hero of the Winds on our screen, that have this ability. You target Hero of the Winds with +2/+1, and then all your other creatures will effectively get +2/+1 as well. I think that combined with the heroic creatures, Phalanx Tactics is amazing, but again, I'm not sure how good aggressive decks really look to me in this environment, but if you are playing a low-to-the-ground aggressive deck with a high creature count that can actually get through and has some decent reach options, this is going to be one of your better options for just closing the game out. So I'll give it a 1.5 in a vacuum, but again, in these aggressive decks, it easily increases to a 2 or 2.5, which is a very playable card. But moving on to Storyteller here. This is decent on stats alone, although not incredibly impressive in this day and age at least, but still a decent card, and it gets you some form of card advantage, and you gain a little bit of life. Again, sort of a death knell to the aggressive decks in this environment. I think this is a fairly slow environment, especially from the initial reports of the sealed environment on Arena. This looks to be relatively slow. So I think that Storyteller was a great card, not only against the aggressive decks, but just a decent mid-range card and a good top deck as well in the late game. If you've got an enchantment, and especially an enchantment creature in your graveyard that you want to get back, Storyteller is really decent. It does a great impression of like Gravedigger, which is a very playable limited creature. So, and it's got better stats too. So, big fan of Storyteller. I will give this a 2.5, although I'm tempted to give it a higher score. Now, Hero of the Winds, decently statted creature. This is a fairly strong limited environment, sealed environment. I just want to throw that out there. I think the card quality in general is much higher this time around, especially when you see cards like this right here, you know, decent heroic ability, but good stats and can block in the air if that's what you needed to do. So it's not shut out of being played in control decks and decks that do want to slow things down a little bit more, because you're going to be blocking an awful lot with that stat line. But if you want to play aggressively with it, you can. And I really like the sort of different uses this card has on it. I think it's worth the 4 mana rate, but just barely. So I'll give it a 2. I think it's a great filler for the curve, but a decent creature too. Don't get me wrong. Now let's move on to Heliod's Punishment and Favored of Erois. Now, Heliod's Punishment, I do think is playable removal, especially in a format or in a deck that can shut the door, can close the door on the game quickly after playing this. So in aggressive decks, it gets much, much better, but I still think it's a playable piece of pseudo removal in most decks, especially considering it's going to trigger enchantment synergies and stuff like that. So I do think that it's great, especially again in aggressive decks, but at the same time, I'm not 100% sure how great it's going to be in long games, obviously. So I'm tentative about it, but I still think it's a good piece of removal. I'll give it a 2.5. You'll probably play it in your deck. Favored of Erois, I do really like, but again, I'm a little bit wary of because you're not going to be playing an enchantment literally every single turn, for the most part. So the use of this card is going to drop off on turn, 6, 7, 8 as the game drags on. Now, if you can top deck enchantment, suddenly this becomes much better. And again, if you can put auras on it that, boost its power toughness, and suddenly this becomes the most dangerous creature on the table. But having to proc double strike every turn for it to really be a good attacker kind of hurts. I will say, though, this goes really well with flash auras, which there are some of in this environment, so keep that in mind. If you do have the various flash auras, this becomes really good on your opponent's turn in combat. So that's a little trick I want you to keep in mind with Favored. I do think there's a lot you can do with this card, and it's probably not so hard to proc Constellation in the first place, especially in an aggressive deck that wants the card. In the aura-based archetypes and sealed, this is going to be fantastic, so I'll go ahead and give this a 2.5 as well. I'd probably play it regardless, but you really don't want a 3-mana 2/2. That's not a good card. So I'm a little tentative about that 2.5, but I still think it's quite a playable card if you've got enough enchantments. Now, moving on, we've got Reverent Hoplite, Birth of Melodus, and Captivating Unicorn. Now, Reverent Hoplite, I think it's actually one of the hallmark white limited cards in the entire set. I'm a little bit wary, too, about going monocolored and sealed, so I'm not sure how much I love these devotion payoffs like Gary or like this in sealed, but it should not be too hard. Even in sealed, if you're playing 2 colors, hopefully you'll be able to go white and then a very small splash of another color. There's very often you're going to be able to get like 3 to 4 tokens off of this, and that makes the card very, very good. Again, even in cards that aren't decks that aren't wholly devoted to devotion, I think this could do a fair amount of work. Probably a better card than a lot of people are evaluating it right now. I don't think it necessarily makes the cut in constructed or anything, but who knows? I might be wrong about that, depending on what synergies we have. But in sealed, this is amazing, especially good again with all these heroic creatures that give all your creatures a boost when they get targeted. So really like Reverend Hoplite, and again, I think it's actually one of the most important and sort of most bread and butter cards for white out of the entire set. And and I want to give this a 3.5, if not a 4, but I'll stick with a 3.5. Now, Birth of Melodus, again, a card that I like, especially for slower, more controlling decks. Birth effectively gets you a little bit of card advantage, or at least it trades itself for a card, and it gets you a 0/4, and then the 2 life is at least okay. It's whipped cream, so not a bad card all in all, on rate for 2 mana, kind of like a Wall of Blossoms or a Wall of Omens or something. So I'll take it. Helps you get to that 3rd land drop, which is really understated and sealed. It's something we don't talk about enough, but cards that make sure you get to your 3rd, 4th land drop are often really good, especially when they put a body on the battlefield. Works really well with bounce effects and stuff to let you play it again. So there's a lot of things I like about Birth. I'll give it a 2.5. I think it's a really playable card. Captivating Unicorn. I've always liked these tapper creatures, in sealed especially, but the limited environment at large, I think, is very good for these tapper creatures, especially in more aggressive decks. And Captivating Unicorn actually comes at a pretty decent body, which these tappers usually don't. If you just tap down a creature or 2, being able to get through with a 4/4 can often be pretty dangerous for your opponent. Not a huge fan of the 5 mana rate, and the fact that it doesn't really pip Devotion that much either. I think that matters, but in any case, I'll still give Captivating Unicorn a 2, just because it's a playable card, especially in the aggressive decks, and I think it's a great top end for them, especially if you didn't get all the Reverence Hoplites that you wanted. It's a good 5 mana play. But moving on, you've got Daybreak, Chimera, and Dreadful Apathy, 2 of the best white commons in the entire set. By far, actually, Daybreak Chimera is often just going to be in the late game. A 2 mana 3/3 flyer, really amazing rate, I shouldn't have to tell you, but even on turn 3, this is often going to be a 3 mana 3/3 flyer, which is still a really, really, really good rate in sealed, and I think this is one of the more important cards for aggressive decks in this environment. But even if you're not playing aggressively, this is still a card you probably want to play in white. So, big fan of Daybreak Chimera. I'll give this a 3. I think it's a very important common. Dreadful Apathy, on the other hand, gets my really high marks from me. I think this might be the best common for white in the entire set. The fact that this not only triggers enchantment synergies and stuff like that, and makes sure the creature is inconsequential in the meantime, it also gives you a mana sink later to completely exile the creature, make sure it never escapes after that. I mean, it's really, really good. So, huge fan of this card. I think this is actually the best white removal spell in the set, and again, the best white common. So I will give this a 4.5. I'll give it a 4. I'll give it a 4. Like, removal's never a bomb, so I'll just give it a 4. Now let's move on to Helios Pilgrim, Hero of the Pride, and Indomitable Will. Now, Indomitable Will, much better card than it might look like. Triggers enchantment synergies, including Constellation, at instant speed, and that's a big deal during your opponent's combat step. So is being able to beat creatures in combat that your opponent didn't think you'd be able to beat. Your 2-drop beats their 4-drop in combat after you play Indomitable Will some of the time. That's a huge deal. All these creatures that want you to play auras, all the creatures with Constellation and whatnot that want you to play enchantments at all, Indomitable Will is just really, really good with. And even though it's not like a straight-up counter your removal spell, it is going to be a straight-up counter your removal spell against some things in this format. So just a lot of flexible reasons to play Indomitable Will, and I will give this a 2.5. I think it is one of the stronger auras in the set, even if it's really unassuming at first. And obviously it goes really well with Hero of the Pride. Hero of the Pride, again, just a bear, 2 mana, 2/2, but it's got, this heroic ability on it. And it's like I believe the lowest rated creature in the set, as far as, mana goes. The lowest converted mana cost for this particular ability in the set. And that's really good to me. I'm often going to play 2 mana 2/2s anyway as like a 23rd creature in my deck if I can't find anything else. They're great fillers. So in an aggressive deck, this is just unbelievable as your 2-drop. So I'll give Hero of the Pride a 2.5. I'm pretty excited about it in aggressive decks. Helios Pilgrim, I want to give this a 3 straight up if you've got the auras to support it, that is. If you don't, then it's really not a card you want to play at all. It's kind of a 0 if you don't have good auras in your deck. But if you just have like 2 decent auras in your deck, you want to make sure you don't have both of them in your hand at the same time when you play Helios Pilgrim. So you probably want to have 2 or 3 decent auras in your deck, and if you do, Helios Pilgrim becomes an incredible card. So I'll give this a 3. I'll give it a 3 because tutor effects are especially good in sealed, and especially if you've gotten any really bomb auras in your pool. So really do like Helios Pilgrim. I think it's an important card for white decks and limited. But Glory Bearers and Flicker of Fate are next. Glory Bearers, Again, decent on stats, but not the most impressive thing in the world. I'll give it a 1.5 just because I'm, again, not super impressed, but I do kind of like it. As far as Flicker of Fate, I'll give this a 1.5 too because you're not going to find too many uses for it, but it does flicker tokens and kill them forever. It does flicker creatures with auras on them to make the auras drop off, which might be important in this in this sealed environment. So, for all kinds of reasons. So, really, really like this. A good bit, but again, it's very situational, so I wouldn't put it in my main deck. Most of the time, I'll just give it a 1.5. Now, Karametra's Blessing, Leonin of the Lost Pride, and Nixborn Corsair are next. Karametra's Blessing is a card that the rating will change greatly, depending on how you built your deck and what's in your sealed pool. So, I'll just give it a 1.5 baseline, but again, if you've got enough enchantment creatures and whatnot, or, auras and whatnot in your deck as well, this can be really, really good, or it's just a decent combat trick. I'm actually going to elevate it to a 2, just because it's going to be a decent combat trick in almost any situation, but if you've got the ways to, make this just a counterspell against removal, it's probably one of the better cards in your deck, but I would mostly just count on this being a combat trick, in which case I'll give it a 2. Leonin of the Lost Pride, I'll just give this a 1.5. I'm not super impressed anymore by a 2-mana 3/1. So, sometimes this will proc, and you'll get a little bit of value out of it. And you'll get rid of, an escape card or something like that. But for the most part, it's just filler. I'll give it a 1.5. Nixborn Corsair, much the same. I do like the stats on this. I like the devotion pips as well. And I do think there's some bread and butter to this, but I'm just going to give it a 1.5. I think that very often you're going to be able to do better. But if you can't do any better, it's definitely serviceable. Now, Omen of the Sun and Pious Wayfarer are next. Omen of the Sun, I like. I like pretty much every Omen. This gives you a little bit of board presence. Any enchantment synergies are triggered. Constellation is triggered. That's really sweet. And you can pay 3 to sack Omen of the Sun, scry 2, just like you can all of these. So that's really good late game value. That puts a card in the yard for escape. So all of these Omens do so much synergistically in this environment that I'm going to rate them all fairly high. I'll give Omen of the Sun a 2.5. So, oh, and by the way, I didn't even mention it. It's really good with all the creatures that make all your other stuff grow when you target them. The heroic ability in the set. So, there you go. It gives you 2 bodies for that. It's just, omens are really good pretty much universally. And Sun is no different. Now, Pious Wayfarer is the kind of 1-drop that I don't particularly like in sealed. It's going to be easy in the aggressive decks to trigger this fairly consistently in the first couple of turns, but anything beyond turn 3 or 4, this is going to drop off in value immensely, and I don't necessarily care for it. So I'm just going to give this a 1.5. I don't think that it's actually very impressive unless you've got an extremely high density of enchantments in your deck. And for that matter, you can also double spell on a lot of turns and really make this, a 3/4 or something. That's when it's good, but that's the dream, and it's not going to happen in every game, especially with a limited sealed pool. So we're going to move on to Transcendent Envoy, Sunmane Pegasus, and Sentinels Eyes. Transcendent Envoy, obviously, again, in a deck where you've got a bunch of auras, this becomes really good, and it's just a 2-mana 1/2 flyer by itself, so it's at least a decent package for that mana cost in sealed. So I want to just go ahead and start this off as a 2, but in any deck with a bunch of auras, it becomes a 2.5 pretty easily, if not a 3. But we'll start it off at a 2 because it's a decent body width and evasive ability, and it's going to trigger any enchantment synergies. So I'll give it a 2. Sunmane Pegasus, a 4-mana 2/3 flying isn't great, but these are great abilities on this mana sink here. And if you can put an aura on Pegasus, especially one that boosts its power toughness, this mana sink becomes incredible. But make sure you don't get blown out, because sometimes you'll put an aura on it and pay mana for this, to put 2 abilities on it till end of turn, and that's when your opponent will remove it. And that feels like even more of a blowout than usual. So there's kind of a push-pull to the card, but I do think if you can protect it, slap an aura on it that makes it big, these are 2 really good abilities to have, and it's already got a great ability. So I would probably play at least 1 copy of this in my deck regardless, so I'll give it a 2.5. Even though I know that sounds like a really good score, I think there's a lot of decks that are going to be able to take advantage of this, much more so than we see right now. But in any case, there's also Sentinels Eyes. Oh, well, actually, let me go back to Sunmane real quick. I'll say this one more time. The creatures that have that heroic ability to give all your creatures a boost when you target them with something, this is decent if you have any of those on the battlefield, because when it becomes a 3/3 or a 4/3, being able to give it vigilance and lifelink is a huge deal. But anyway, Sentinels Eyes, Rumbling Sentry, Revoke Existence. Now, Sentinels Eyes, I do think it's a decent aura, but you really have to be all in on the auras theme for this to be a great aura. You have to be all in on Constellation for this to be a good aura. So I'm going to give it a 1.5 because I'm really intrigued by it, but I'm not sure that it's a great card. Rumbling Sentry, not the best stats in the world, but do note that 6 toughness is some of the highest toughness in this entire sealed environment. Some of the creatures aren't necessarily huge this time around. You know, aside from some of the creatures in the rare slots. Green has, as usual, some summarily big creatures at relatively, low rarity. But for the most part, 6 toughness is an incredibly high toughness stat. And that might matter, but I'm still just going to give this a 1.5. I think it's worth playing at the top end of your curve if you got nothing better, but only when you have nothing better. Revoke Existence, I'll actually give this a 2.5. I think this is main deck, sometimes, creature removal. That, again, exile means a lot, too. So the exile clause on this I'm really happy with as well. And even if you can't kill a creature, you're pretty much always still going to have a target for it on the table, even if you play it in your main deck. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a 2.5. Again, I think it's easily main deckable, one of the better pieces of removal in the entire set from a certain angle. But moving on, last white card, Triumphant Surge, very good piece of removal. I'll give it a 3. It's not always going to have a target, but at the same time, it's often going to have a target in the late game, and it's going to be at least a good one of inclusion in control decks or even aggressive decks. They just want to give that big threat off the board right now. So I do like the card. I think it's worth at least a 1 of, and I'll give it a 3. Now we've moved on to the blue cards here, and again, 2 decent cards on screen, and another one that's not too great. Now Thassa, I'm going to give a 3 to, which may seem like a relatively low score, but it's still a card you're going to play in your main deck pretty much every single time. The tapping down another creature does cost an awful lot, but it's at least a decent mana sink to make sure you can keep their best creature from attacking or blocking, for that matter. If you ever do get the devotion, it's a big nasty lady that attacks, so that's pretty sweet. And you're not always going to have something to target with this passive ability, but sometimes you will, and that's when it's really good. You may have noticed that a lot of the praise that I've had for the card is still situational. You need a lot of mana to tap stuff. You need to have a good creature to target with the passive. You need to have Devotion 5 for it to actually be able to be a creature. So there's a lot of situationality on this, which is why I'm going to give it a 3, but you'll still play it if you get it. You'll play it. But Kiora Best of Seaguard, on the other hand, I should not Seaguard. Kiora Best of Seaguard, on the other hand, maybe the best blue card. Maybe LSV, I believe it was, Luis Scott Vargas has called this the best card in the set in terms of sealed play. I don't know if I'd go that far because 7 mana is a lot. Even in sealed, 7 mana is so freaking much. And there's going to be games where you have this in your opening hand, you get blown out before you even ever get to 5 mana some of the time. So I'm not saying this is the absolute best card in the entire set for sealed, but it is a ridiculous card. If the first chapter doesn't win the game, the second chapter might win the game. And if that doesn't win the game, the third chapter almost certainly will. So in terms of its ability to win you a game, this is probably the biggest bomb in the set, but 7 mana is a lot to ask, even in a format like this. That said, you'll play it. Again, you'll play it if you get it, and if you ever do cast it, it's probably the best card in the set to have on the table to resolve. So again, 7 mana is so much, so I'll give this a 4.5. I don't think that it gets to 5 territory. Ashiok's Erasure, I'll give like a 1, I guess. I don't like 4 mana counter spells. I'm like really adverse to 4 mana counters. But then again, if your opponent has Kiora Best of Seaguard, it'd be nice to have a 4 mana counter, right? So I don't hate Ashiok's Erasure, especially in sealed where a lot of people play, 4 or 5 and even 6 drops with some regularity. So this will sometimes find a target, but I'm just fairly adverse to 4 mana counters, especially considering top decking this is almost never going to feel good. It's going to sit in your hand for like 4 turns. So. And you also don't really want to draw it in your opener either, so it's just kind of in a weird spot where, like, I just don't care for it that much. But if you're hard up and you're in a control deck, you'll probably play it. Now, moving on to Nadir Kraken and Protean Thaumaturge, I think that Nadir Kraken is another one of the best blue bombs in the entire set, period, and maybe one of the best bombs in the whole set, just bar none, not even regarding color. I think that Kraken is incredible because it's going to grow regardless of if you have any ways to proc it. Even having a couple of ways to proc it makes it ludicrous, but it is definitely one of those threats where if you don't answer it, it takes over the game, again, even if you don't have ways to trigger it. So, huge freaking fan of Kraken. I'm going to give this card a 4 because it absolutely must be answered or it completely takes the game over. So that constitutes a bomb. Now, Protean Thaumaturge. This I'm a little iffy on, but again, just like I pointed out before in this review already, if you have auras with flash, this becomes incredible because it can just copy any creature during your opponent's combat step some of the time, and that can be a really tricky, easily exploitable ability. So Big fan of that. I like that. But again, I think that often this isn't probably not going to be as good as you want it to be unless you can use it to like copy your bomb creature that you got or something. But I'll still give it a 3. It's a much better 2-drop than most of the 2-drops in the set, and you'll play it if you're in blue. Down to Illyrios Enraptured, Wavebreak Hippocamp, and Thrix the Sudden Storm. I like Illyrios. I'll start with this. I like all of these cards, but I'll start with Illyrios. Now, I don't love this as much as some people do in Seal, but this is still 2 bodies for 3 mana. If your opponent removes the one, then it just activates the other effectively. Plus, this goes at least somewhat well with like bounce effects, so you can make more and more of these reflection tokens. So, I don't know. I kind of like it, and I'm definitely playing it, especially considering it's an uncommon, so it's not too hard to get. But, you know, I would definitely play this in my sealed deck, and I'd probably even play more than one copy despite the legendary status. So I'll give this a 3. I think it's one of the better blue creatures at the uncommon level, at the lower rarities especially. Wavebreak Hippocamp, good lord. This deck, this archetype is going to be, it looks like red-blue in this environment, but it could also be blue-white in the sealed environment. And there's plenty of ways to make this work, whether you're casting instants or you're casting flash enchantments or even flash creatures like Thrix, for instance. It's really easy to be able to proc Wavebreak Hippocamp, draw cards, and even if it only draws you 1 card in the game, then it's definitely done its job. You know, it can't win the game on stats alone. 3 mana 2/2s are terrible. That's not a good stat line at all. But if it draws you 1, it's great. If it draws you 2 or 3 cards, it's probably the best card in your deck. So I'll give this a 3.5. I think it's a very, very effective card. Thrix, I also think is really good. Just this based on stats alone, kind of the opposite of Hippocamp. You know, I don't think that the final ability on this, the uncounterable thing, is that great in sealed, especially in the upcoming environment. But I do think that just the body and the flash is good enough to play this, because it's often going to ambush your opponent's best creature, kill it, and leave you with the best threat on the table. And that is definitely worth 5 mana. Again, you play air elementals in sealed, and this is 100 times better than air elemental, despite the legendary status. So I'm going to give this a 4. I think it's a ridiculous card. Now, moving on, we got Thassa's Intervention and Thassa's Oracle. Now, Intervention, I think is great, especially in the standard environment, but that's not what we're really here to talk about. I think this is still going to be a decent counterspell if you got nothing better to do with it at some points in the game, but just the fact that this is a draw the 2 best cards in your deck, depending on how much mana you have, is probably really good, because it's going to be decent at 4 or 5 mana, but it's going to be really crazy at like 6, 7, 8 mana, which you'll sometimes get to in sealed. So, playable card, I'll give it a 3. I think it's really good in terms of a card that not only gives card advantage, but again, as a counter, I like the flexibility on it. Now, Thassa's Oracle, this is, I think, more of a draft kind of card. There is a draft mill deck and even a draft mill yourself deck Thassa's Oracle is going to be great in, but even in just a regular sealed environment, it's kind of a super omen speaker, yeah, kind of. I like that about it, so I can't really hate on this card, and, you know, you rip it off the top of your library in the late game, suddenly it's a really good card that gets you whatever you need, puts it on top of your library, but still lets you get the best card next turn out of the top, you know, however many, you know, 6, 7, 8 cards of your library sometimes. So that's very good, decent in the early game, great in the late game, and if nothing else, it's a body on the battlefield that also adds to further devotion synergies. So I'll give this a 3. I think it's a very good card, all things considered. Moving on to Caliphate, Beloved by the Sea, as well as Metamized Prophecy and One with the Stars. I think these are all decent cards here. Caliphate, I'll give a 3 to. I think it's a solid card. There's a lot of incidentals on this, you know, making your opponent pay a little bit more and taxing them to do stuff to your guys. Always a decent ability, although not the most impactful thing in sealed, but just having another devotion payoff and an enchantment creature to proc those synergies, all good. So there's a lot to like about Caliphate. Even if I'm not a huge fan of the toughness, I still think this is one of the better creatures in blue, especially at this mana cost. So you'll play it pretty much every time you get it, and you're heavy blue, so I'll give it a 3. Metamized Prophecy, kind of a much trickier card in sealed to pull off than just about any other format. You know, you want to make sure that when you choose that card, you're actually going to play that card, because what your opponent does on the subsequent turn might really change what you end up wanting to play once it rolls around to your next turn. So you want to make absolutely sure you're going to choose that card or play that card that you chose. So if you do, though, this is scry 2, draw 2, 2 mana, and triggers enchantment strategies, and goes to your graveyard to escape things and stuff. So just a big fan of a lot of the like junk auras in this, or junk sagas in this environment. Metamized Prophecy is no different. It's always going to at least scry 2 for 2 mana for you, and get a thing on the battlefield, and trigger Constellation. So much that it does that I can't give it a bad score. I'll give it a 2.5. one with the stars, is removal. By the way, the reason that this says creature or enchantment is so it doesn't fall off as soon as the creature becomes an enchantment. Just the more you know, right? But I'll give this a 3 because it's decent blue removal. Even if it does cost an awful lot to play, it's still blue removal. Moving on to Sage of Mysteries and Sea God Scorn. Sage of Mysteries, I don't actually love. Again, it looks like the mill deck is going to be draft more than it is sealed. I think it's going to be very tough to get, you know, all of these different mill cards and actually make it work in sealed. And if you got the right pool, maybe, but it's going to be really tough to pull off. So if you actually want to get Michelle Williams, it looks exactly like Michelle Williams, doesn't it? Anyway, if you actually want to get Michelle Williams to work, it's going to take an awful lot of synergy, and that's probably more for the draft environment. I'll give this card like a 0.5. I really don't care for it. Sea God Scorn, I actually do like. Even at 6 mana, I still have to give this a 2 because it's going to get rid of all the tokens and stuff, kill them forever. All the creatures with auras on them and stuff, gets rid of them. That's always nice. Gets rid of enchantments and stuff too, so it'll get rid of banishing lights and whatnot, at least for a turn, and that can make a big difference. There's just a lot to like about Sea God Scorn. Even at 6 mana, I probably wouldn't play more than one of these in the deck. So I'll just give it, I'll give it a 2. I'll give it a 2. I think it's probably worth playing the 1 copy, but it's not the removal piece that you want it to be a lot of the time. But still a good removal piece. Let's move on to Whirlwind Denial as well as Threnody Singer and Stinging Lionfish. Now, Whirlwind Denial, I think is more of a standard card than anything else, but at the same time, if you're hard up for counterspells in your sealed control deck, this could go really well. So I'd play it in that instance, but not in too many others. I'll give it a 1.5. Threnody Singer, I actually really like this card a lot. It's another blue devotion payoff. That's with more of those at lower rarities is always good. It's got decent stats on its own, really good keyword abilities, both flash and flying are nice. Ambushes a creature when it comes in. What else could you want? I guess you could want it to be an enchantment creature, but you know, you can't have it all. I'll give this a 3. I think it's a great curve filler in blue decks, and honestly a good reason to be heavy blue in the first place. So I really like Singer. Stinging Lionfish, I kind of like this too. You know, 2 mana 2/1's at least decent curve filler, but some of the time it's going to be able to do really tricky stuff, whether it's, you know, tap down your opponent's stuff or during their combat step, untap one of your creatures, you know, untap a 3/4 to block a 3/3 or something. And that could be really, really neat, but it's going to be kind of tough to engineer some of those situations. That said, if you can, you get a lot of value out of your 2-drop with this thing. So I kind of like it, but I can't give it more than like a 2. You know, it's a card that I'll play, but probably not one of the most powerful cards in the deck or anything. Good curve filler, though. Next, we've got Shimmering Chimera and Shoal Kraken. I really like Chimera a lot. I do. I don't love its toughness, but I do like, you know, 4 mana 3/2s in the air. It's a snapping drake. Those are playable stats. But if you do have like a creature enchantment with a decent ETB trigger or something, or maybe you've got an aura stuck to one of your small creatures that you want to stick to one of your big creatures, you can do this, but you don't have to do anything. It's a May, you know, well, actually, it's not a May ability. I thought it was. At the beginning of your upkeep, return up to 1, so it is a May ability. You don't even have to do it if you don't want to do it. So that's really sweet. Just in terms of stats and effect on the game, you know, I really like this. And especially if you've got the right tools to exploit it, it's a great card. I'll go ahead and give it a 3. I think it's a card you're going to play more often than not. Shoal Kraken, again, a card I think you're going to play more often than not. If you do have the ability to trigger this a few times in a game, it gets you very real value, and it's got great stats for a 5-drop, so I'll give this a 3 as well. I think it's a card you're very likely to play in your sealed deck if you're blue. Moving on, we got Brine Giant, Chain to Memory, Deny the Divine. 3 cards I don't like quite as much. Brine Giant, I think you have to be, again, just all in on enchantments, and cheap enchantments at that, to actually get this card down for a reasonable cost. But if you can cast it for 4 mana, 5/6 is great. So if you got 3 enchantments out, it becomes really good. So this is one that I'm on the fence about. But, you know, having to have, like, counting on having a bunch of enchantments on the battlefield isn't necessarily something I want. Like, Infinity for enchantments is something that could be really good in Pauper or Standard or something even, but not in Sealed. I think it's really, really a tough ask to have 3 or 4, to guarantee 3 or 4 enchantments and make this worth playing. So, but you could, again, you could just counterpoint. You can make the argument this is worth it for 5 mana. You can make the argument this might be worth it for 6 mana, right? I mean, 5/6 is really good stats. So, end of the day, I'll give this a 2.5. I think it's probably worth maybe playing 1 copy. And if you have 10 enchantments, 12 enchantments in your sealed deck, which is maybe tough to hit, but if you do have 12 enchantments, suddenly it probably does become a good card. So I don't want to misevaluate it. I'll give it a 2, 2.5. But Chain to Memory, I don't much care for. I never really like these minus minus power but not minus toughness abilities. Sometimes they will let you best a creature in combat and, kill something you're not supposed to kill. Your creature stays alive. Those feel really, really good, but usually they're not worth the slot to me. Even though this one scries too, I'm still not a huge fan. Even, I will say though, if there's one good thing, even if you can't really do much with it, you can at least kind of fog one big creature and scry 2 to set up your next draw. So there are good things about the card, and it's probably better than a lot of the usual, hose power but not toughness spells, especially at this rate. It's just 1 mana, but it's still got to be worth a slot at the end of the day, so I'm just going to give it a 1. Moving on to Deny the Divine. This is 3 mana, 2 and a blue. And that's a bad rate for counter spells in sealed most of the time. I'm just not a huge fan of 3 or 4 mana counter spells, but at least this is a hard counter, and there are a bunch of 4, 5, and 6 drops in sealed that this can counter. This is going to counter almost any spell. I mean, creatures or enchantments are going to be the bulk of most decks. Even though this can't counter a lot of removal spells and whatnot, I still think it can find a target, and it's even not the worst top deck in the world. So I hate to sound like I'm giving it such a hard time, but a lot of the times these 3 mana counter spells aren't even necessarily worth that much weight in sealed, unless, again, you're hard up for counter spells in a sealed control deck. So I'll give this a 2. Because it's a pretty decent hard counter some of the time, but again, you have to be pretty hard pressed to end up playing it. And you have to be in a very specific deck. So moving on to Eidolon of Philosophy and Elite Instructor here. Eidolon, again, not a huge fan of 1-drops and sealed. This one's not that much different. The ability costs so much to use, but if you ever can use it, it's at least decent. Triggers enchantments, synergies, and stuff. So it's not the worst card ever, but I'm still just going to give it a 1.5. You'd have to, again, be pretty hard up. You'd have to be hard pressed for, filler cards in your deck to end up actually playing this. I hope you can find 23 better cards than this, is what I'm saying. On to Elite Instructor, a fine card. I don't, again, 2 mana or 3 mana 2/2 is not the best stat line in the world, but the ability to draw a card, fuel escape a little bit, all of that's really, really good. Sometimes you'll drop an escape card in the yard with it. All of that's sweet. Really good ETB trigger. An abusable ETB trigger for a couple of cards we've seen so far, like Thassa, for instance. So I am a fan of Elite Instructor. Even if you have to draw the card and then immediately discard it because you don't have anything else in your hand, it might fuel escape. So, maybe with Elite Instructor, I'll give it a 2.5. I think it's a very playable blue common. But moving on, we've got Nixborn Seaguard, Naiad of Hidden Coves, and Memory Drain. Nixborn Seaguard, 4 mana 2/5 is at least decent stats, and it's good devotion pips plus an enchantment creature. I like that the common level at every color has one of these, but it's not anything to get really excited about. I'll give this one a 2 because the stats are there. Naiad of Hidden Coves, again, a decent card for this archetype in particular, but aside from that, the stats aren't very impressive. And even if you are playing the archetype, you really have to have a bunch of cards in your hand, and you have to engineer this 1 or 2 amazing turns, and it's not going to happen every time. But when it does happen, it's going to be good. I'll give the card a 1. If I could give a 1.75, I'd do that. 1.75. Memory Drain, again, 4 mana counterspell. Even the draw 2 doesn't make it insanely good, but if you can counter something with it, it's going to be really sweet. But again, I hope you can find 23 better cards in this to play in your deck, but if you're playing control, you might find 1 slot for it. It might counter something, and suddenly you scry 2, set up an amazing draw, whatever. It could work out for you. I'm not saying it won't, but I still really can't give it more than like a 1 or a 1.25 or something. You can play it in control, but probably not more than 1 copy, and you won't feel great about playing the 1. Let's move on to Morphosis and Glimpse of Freedom. Now, the Ick, I think, is one of the best blue commons, actually. This is really good blue removal that also triggers enchantment synergies and stuff. Really good with some specific cards in the set. We'll get to Hateful Eidolon soon. Great with that card, but in any case, it's good with anything with Constellation, obviously. And having, basically a card that makes a creature 0/1 is sometimes better than actually having removal in very specific and narrow situations, but nonetheless, sometimes it can be. So I really like Ick, and if I'm playing blue, I'm playing as many copies of this as I get, because again, it's effectively just removal for blue. So I'm going to give this a 3.5. I think it's maybe the best blue common in the entire set, but Glimpse of Freedom, I think, again, really good for any sort of blue control style decks. If you're trying to slow it down, this is a great card to get some card advantage over the late game. And there's going to be some sealed games where you actually get to cast this 3 times total. Just 1 copy of it 3 times total. Not going to always happen, but very often you're going to just be able to cast this as a think twice, and that's when it's going to be a great piece. I'll give it a 2.5. It's going to be really good in those decks that want to slow things down, and even decks that aren't necessarily slowing things down so much will still play a card like this some of the time. Like the decks that say want to cast things on their opponent's turn, this is great for. So you'll play it in most decks. On to Omen of the Sea, as well as Riptide Turtle and Sleep of the Dead. Now, one of these I like, the other two, okay. Omen of the Sea, very good. Again, I love omens. I've already explained why. Instant speed, enchantment triggers, all that, really sweet. But this also draws you a card and scries 2. It's preordained. It scries 2 again later in the game, puts cards in the yard for escape. Just amazing. Amazing card. Again, one of the better blue commons in the entire set for sealed. I'll give this thing a 3. I think it's that good. Riptide Turtle on the other hand. A 2-mana 0/5 flash defender. Very weird that a turtle has flash, but I guess whatever. But still, I've said this before. It reminds me of the turtle from Finding Nemo. Whose name I never really figured out. Is it Crash? Let me know in the comments section. I think it's Crash. But anyway, Crash is decent, but not great. It's obviously not that much to get excited about. I really wish it was an enchantment creature, but in these slow decks that want a good, ground presence in the early game to block, it could be at least decent, but I can't give it more than like a 1. I really can't. But Sleep of the Dead, I also think it's kind of bad. Sometimes in aggressive decks, I like these tap abilities, especially given the fact you can cast this more than once, but I really don't think you should play this unless A, you're aggressive, and B, both have to be true, and B, you don't have too many other escape cards this can compete with in your deck. So I'm not a huge fan of Sleep of the Dead, and I will just give this like a 1, maybe even like a 0.5. I just don't think that under most circumstances you should be playing this card. But let's move on to Starlet Mantle and Stern Dismissal. Both cards I do kind of like. Starlet Mantle is effectively a counterspell that also triggers, enchantment synergies and stuff like that. So, and makes the creature bigger. I just think this is a really, really good effect if you're trying to get tricky with enchantment triggers and stuff like that. So, big, huge, dumb fan of this, and it's going to blow out some opponents on some turns, although it's going to sit in your hand on other turns, so I'm not saying it's the best card in blue or anything, but I will give it a 2. I think there's going to be a lot of ways you can justify playing this card in your main, but Stern Dismissal is going to be great against not only tokens, but, again, creatures with auras on them and stuff. There's a lot of reasons to sort of value bounce more in this set in sealed than you usually do. The Stern Dismissal might deserve a one-of copy in your main deck. Again, especially if you're like hard up on removal, or you're kind of tempo based, you have some aggressive strategies yourself. I think Stern Dismissal gets much better in those situations. So I'll give it a 2. I'm not going to play it every single time, but again, this is a card I could justify playing a lot. Moving on. We've got Triton, Waverider, Towering Wave Mystic, and Vexing Gull. Vexing Gull is one of my favorite blue commons. Even if it's not one of the absolute most powerful, I still really like it. I've always liked Wind Drakes, 3-mana 2/2 flyers. This takes it to the next level, allows it to ambush stuff during combat. That's really, really sweet. Even though it's not always going to kill stuff in combat, it definitely can kill stuff in combat on occasion. So, big fan of this. It also, by the way, triggers any of the stuff that wants you to cast spells on your opponent's turn, too. So, I really like Vexing Gull. I think it's got a lot to do in this sealed environment, and I'll give it a 2.5. It's extremely playable, especially for a common. Towering Wave Mystic, however, again, in sealed, not a big fan of all of these mill cards. I'll give it a 0.5. It is, again, a decent curve filler if you need a 2-mana 2/1, but I really hope you can do better in the 2-drop slot than this. Triton Waverider is a 4-mana 3/3 maybe flying. And I'm not sure that's good enough some of the time. I don't just want to play a Hill Giant, 4-mana 3/3. I don't want to do that. And after turn 4, you're probably going to be playing less and less enchantments. But if you can just proc this 1 or 2 turns of the game, it's probably good enough. And again, if you can proc Constellation on your opponent's turn, Waverider becomes really good some of the time. So, just for sort of ambushing flyers and whatnot. So there are, again, narrow situations this card can be really good, and some situations where the card's going to be medium to decent. So I'll give it a 2. I think it's a playable card, but I don't think it's supremely playable. Moving on, Sweet Oblivion and Thirst for Meaning. Sweet Oblivion, this is a really good contrast here. Sweet Oblivion, I'll give a 0.5. Again, I don't love these mill cards in this set. If you have 3 Sweet Oblivions and, 2 other cards that mill yourself and 3 Thassa's Oracles, like, go for it. Go for it, Queen. I'm into it. That's awesome, but I just don't think that it's usually going to happen. I'll give it a 0.5. Thirst for Meaning, on the other hand, I'll give a 3 to, if not a 3.5. It's that good. 3 mana to draw 3. Add instant speed is just huge for a lot of decks, but especially control decks. And it's going to be pretty easy to find an enchantment to discard, and that further fuels escape synergies and stuff too. So, Whew, Thirst for Meaning is a very, very good card, and again, one of the better blue commons. I'll give it a 3. Moving on, final blue card, Witness of Tomorrow's. Really solid card right here. 5 mana 3/4 flyer, not the best stats, but at least decent stats. I wish it was more devotion pips. This is like one of the only sets where not having double color in your cost is a bad thing. You know, I would take more devotion pips, but still. 5 mana 3/4 flyer at the common level, good enough, and it's a good mana sink. You couldn't really ask for too much more. And by the way, it procs enchantment synergies and stuff too, so I'll give this card a 2.5. I'll give this card a 2.5. I think you're going to play it most of the time. But moving on to black here, and we're going to take a look at Erebos the Bleak-Hearted first, along with Ephemia the Cacophony and E2 Extinction. I like all these cards. Erebos, again, like I've said with all these gods, sometimes it's going to be much harder to get to 5 devotion than you might think it is, but I think it's a little bit easier in black than some of these other colors for what it's worth. And I do think that actually, before I even get started on black, I think black is maybe the best color in sealed, just period. That's in a set where all the colors look stronger than usual, honestly. It's a very strong sealed environment compared to the power level that we're used to again. But black is an especially jacked color in my mind, and Erebos is sort of a good way to start that trend, because I think this god is way better than the other 2 gods we've seen so far in sealed, just because this kills stuff. You know, you can sacrifice creatures. Yeah, you have to get stuff off of your side of the board, so there's some parity there, but this can kill creatures, and having a big giant creature that has the ability to kill creatures is insane. That's just insane as a mana sink, but this also allows you to draw cards on occasion. It's a May ability, which is really good, so I'll give Erebos a 4. I think this is a very good god, easily the best one we've seen so far. Ephemia the Cacophony is playable on its own. You know, 2 mana 2/1 flying is decent stats, but if it ever gets you 1 creature, it's way more valuable than just 2 mana, right? You produce just so much value, and if it gets you 2 creatures ever, you know, it gets you 6 power worth of stats effectively at any point in the game, then like it's just maybe the best card in your deck. Like this card can really punish your opponent for removing your enchantments. This lets you swing in with your enchantment creatures a little bit more liberally, knowing that you'll be able to get 2/2s out of them at the end of turn, or at least 1 2/2. So I just really like this. Allows you to maintain a board presence and stay aggressive, you know. So big fan of Ephemia, both in constructed and sealed. But in sealed, I'll give this a 3.5. You're going to play it every time, and there's going to be a lot of times where it gets you extra value. So really like Ephemia. But E2 Extinction, just maybe one of the best removal spells in the entire set, especially considering there's not that many ways to just point and click removal at planeswalkers in the sealed environment in this set. This is maybe the only way, or one of the only ways. So I really like E2 Extinction. You'll play it every single time. I mean, you'll play it whenever you get it, but you can't call it a bomb, so I'll give it a 4. I think it might be one of the best removal spells in the entire format, though, so keep that in mind. Erebos' Intervention, another really good removal spell right here that can also hose graveyards, but most of the time, if you're doing that, then you didn't do it right. Especially in sealed, you really should just be playing this as a removal spell. If this takes out, you know, a 3 or 4 toughness creature and gains you that much life, it's a very good spell, especially at instant speed. So, love Erebos' Intervention. I'll give this a 4 as well, just because I like it as a removal spell and a way to get back into the game. Gravebreaker Lamia is, you know, at least a 3 on stats alone, but it does, you know, help out any escape synergies that you might be getting at. It's also got, you know, synergy with enchantments and whatnot, with constellations, so it just does so much more than you might think when you first look at it. Plus the body is stout enough that I'll give this at least a 3, but it could be like a 3.25. But I'm going to move on to Agonizing Remorse, Woe Strider, and Timuret Calls the Dead, all decent cards. Agonizing Remorse I'll almost always play, if I'm not like particularly aggressive, but even if I'm really aggressive, I might play this card. If you got nothing better to do in your 2-drop slot and you don't mind playing this over a body, you probably do. So I'll give this card a 3. I was going to say 2.5, but I'll give it a 3. I think it's very powerful. Woe Strider is nuts. The card is very nuts. Even in sealed, where you might not have that many things to do with the sacrifice a creature clause, the other parts of this card actually shine in sealed like the most, because it gets you 2 bodies, and that's always really good. Just extra bodies on one card is always good. Plus, the escape isn't extremely hard to get. You'll probably be able to do this at least once in a game. And it gets even bigger. It becomes a really stout body when it does escape. I've always liked creatures that can come back from removal, and escape creatures are obviously very good at doing that. So they're really hard to deal with, and they make removal both more of a premium than usual and less effective than usual at the same time. So I love creatures like this. I love the fact that it comes back bigger. I love the fact that both times it's going to give you a go devote for what that's worth. It's worth a lot, honestly. Bodies on the battlefield is always good, especially, again, if you've got auras that can boost your goats, or those heroic creatures that make your goats bigger whenever you target the heroic creature with something. There's a lot of reasons to just want extra bodies on the field. So I really do like Woe Strider. Again, I think a format like this is what brings out the value of its other abilities, aside from the sacrifice a creature ability. And I really like it in sealed an awful lot. Very powerful card. I'll give it a 3.5. Timurit Calls the Dead. If you've got enough, creatures or enchantments, which again you should in your sealed deck, this is just, 2 bodies on the battlefield and gain and scry some amount. So that's just almost always going to be good. Plus enchantment synergies. When it goes to the graveyard, you can, fuel escape with it and stuff. So I love sagas in this format, and this isn't like a junk saga or anything. This is often going to be like a History of Benalia, or at least do like an impression of it, and put 2 bodies on the battlefield, and 2 bodies on one card is always good, especially when they're 2/2s. And the incidental Chapter 3 value is also probably better than you might rate it at. So I'll give this card a 3.5. I think it's going to be playable almost every time you get it. But again, if you're relatively low on creatures and enchantments in like a control deck, probably stay away from it. For the most part, this is a great card. But we'll move on. Treacherous Blessing and Nightmare Shepherd. Treacherous Blessing, I'm just going to give like a 0.52. Usually 3 mana, 3 cards is going to be great, but you have to be sure you're going to be able to get this stupid thing off the battlefield immediately, or in the next turn or 2 when you play it, and it's probably not going to be worth it. If you can't, and there's not too many ways to actually be able to do it. So unless you have a bunch of bounce effects that allow you to bounce your own enchantments, and there's really not too many in the sealed environment, I'm just not a huge fan. So I'll actually bump it up to like a 1, just in case you do have ways to exploit it. But again, you have to have an awful lot of ways to exploit it. But we'll move on to Nightmare Shepherd, which I think is amazing. This is one of the best black bombs for sealed, period. This is really good against removal, like really good against removal, and it's a super stout, amazingly statted body for this environment in and of itself. So just one of the best black rares you can possibly open. I'll give this a 4.5. I think it's crazy. We'll move on to Drag to the Underworld. Again, one of the best removal pieces in the entire set. If it's not like the 2 white 3-drop enchantments that do, that destroy something, well, not destroy, exile something, or eat to extinction, then it's this. There's kind of a short list of amazing removal for the sealed environment. This is definitely like in the top 5 of that list. So Drag to the Underworld is just amazing. I'll give this card a 4. It's a removal spell that's usually just going to cost 2 mana, but even if it costs 4, you'll pay that for it. Elspeth's Nightmare, I'm going to rank a little bit higher than you might think, y'all. Nightmare, I think, is a 3.5. Because even if just the first chapter pops off, it's probably good enough. But if you can get the first and second chapter to pop, it's really good. So if you can get this on turn 3 or even on turn 4, it's very likely in sealed that both the first and second chapters are going to go off. And if you do that, this is an amazing 2-for-1 in a lot of situations. And a lot of people are going to be playing creatures, even creatures that aren't enchantments in the sealed environment, or enchantments, even enchantments that aren't creatures. Is what I meant to say, in the sealed environment. So I think this card is even more likely to proc than it would be normally. So I like Elspeth's Nightmare, and I'll give it a pretty decent rating. I'll actually give it a 3. I'll just give it a 3. But moving on to Enemy of Enlightenment, as well as Grey Merchant of Asphodel and Hateful Eidolon. Enemy of Enlightenment is not amazing. It's a 6-drop that can sometimes be like a 2/2, and in some games it's a 6-drop that's dead when it hits the table. But it does get technically bigger as the game goes on, or at least that's the way the design of the card is supposed to work. And it punishes your opponent. Could be really good against control when resolved, if it's alive when you resolve it, right? But worry about that. Your opponent might, draw a couple of cards at the end of your turn and just effectively kill this thing. You really wouldn't want that. So I think there's a lot of, negatives against the card, but it'd still be a decent win condition that punishes decks that do want to keep cards in their hands. So I'm kind of middle on the road of it, and I'll just give it a 1.5, although I think it could be better than that. Moving on to Gary, though, I got to give it a 4, I think, even though it's not as likely to win you the game in sealed as it is in, say, a format like Standard or Pioneer or whatever. It's still likely to swing the game. If it doesn't end the game outright, it's usually going to do, 4 or 5 damage to your opponent, and give you that 5 life gain back, and be a really good body on the battlefield while it's there. So even if Grey Merchant doesn't win as many games outright in sealed, I still have to give it a very high score, because it's going to be a super impactful card in just about any game where you resolve it. So I'll give it a 4. Hateful Eidolon. I love this thing, but again, it really requires that you're working with a lot of enchantment synergies. Do keep in mind, if you have things like Mire's Grasp, we'll get to it in a second, enchantments, auras, that kill your opponent's creatures, this thing goes up in value immensely. But also, if you've got a bunch of auras yourself and you want to, you know, not get 2-for-1, Eidolon's one of the best 1-drops in the format. So I actually, again, not a huge fan of 1-drops in Seal, but this is one of the few that I think is amazing, and I'd probably play it especially if I had the right synergies. So I'll give the card a 2.5, but it's sometimes just going to be like a 1.5. But if you have the proper cards to support it, it's an easy 2.5. Moving on, let's look at Timuret, Chosen from Death, Pharika Spawn, and Mire Triton. All cards that I like. Timuret, usually going to have a reasonably high toughness. It's at the very least going to be a 2-2. But in a lot of sets, or a lot of, you know, game states, it's going to be a 2-5, 2-6. So really, really good blocker here, but it doesn't really do much more than that unless it's sniping an escape card here and there. If it's doing that, that's pretty decent, but for the most part, it's just not super impressive. It's the card I like the least out of these three, but it's still a decent filler 2-drop and better than a lot of the other black 2-drops in the set, so I will give it a 2.5. Pharika's Spawn, huge fan of this card. Not great against the token-based decks and stuff, but still decently statted when you first play it. Fairly easy to escape, even though the actual mana cost is high. 3 cards is not that much to ask. And it gets even bigger. It becomes usually the biggest creature on the table when you escape it, and it eats one of your opponent's creatures. You don't get to target what you kill, but still, making them sacrifice something is at least, you know, value. It's at least board presence over your opponent. It's a 2-for-1. All that's good. So, and you're kind of daring your opponent to kill it in the first place, right? Like, please kill my Spawn so I can make one of your creatures die. So, huge fan of Spawn. I think it's a really good uncommon in this set. Even though I wouldn't play a bunch of copies of it, the one copy is at least worth it, and I'll give this card a 3. I think it's really good. Mire Triton, love this 2-drop. You know, it fuels escape stuff, might even drop an escape card in your yard for future use or whatever. The life gain is incidental, whatever, but what this really is a 2-drop that can take down a 4-drop. Or a 5, or even a 6-drop some of the time, or at least deter them from attacking so you can actually get some time to develop your board state or your plan, whatever you're trying to do with your deck. So I love any small creature with death touch, but this also has, you know, enter the battlefield value. I think it's a really good 2-drop, especially for the lower rarities, and I'll give this a 3. I'm going to play it in just about every black deck. So moving on to Minions Return and Inevitable End. Inevitable End, I'll give a 3. This is a really solid removal piece right here that's at least going to kill one thing, but it's always going to end up killing the thing it's attached to, right? Even if you force them to kill a smaller creature first, eventually it's going to kill the thing you've attached it to, and that's awesome. So this is a very playable removal spell. I'll give it a 3. Return, actually a sweet card, especially if you're about to kill one of your opponent's creatures. Just kill it, Minions Return, you know, with flash in response to your own removal spell, and get the best thing on their side of the battlefield. It's really cool, but obviously this saves your own creatures while triggering any enchantment strategies at instant speed, which I've already talked about can be a big deal. So I think there's a lot of neat little narrow pockets for Minions Return to fit into. But again, it's got to be worth the slot in your deck. And that's where I think the argument sort of fails, because there's going to be a lot of games where this sits in your hand for 2 or 3 turns with nothing better to do. And those cards are usually bad, even in sealed. When this does pop off the way you want it to, though, it's an amazing card. So I got to give it a 1.5, because there's going to be situations where it's incredible. Underworld Dreams, not a great card. In sealed, I'm really interested in this card. It's one of my favorite, like, old school cards from back in the day. Love that it got the reprint, but probably not great in sealed, all things considered. Unless your opponent's playing something really slow and dirtily, or a control deck, they can't deal with dreams. It's just probably not the best card for your main deck. Keep it in mind for your board, but I really can't give it more than like a 0.5 for the sealed environment. Aspect of Lamprey may be the best black aura, all things considered. Lifelink is traditionally very good, but this always, like 2-for-1's the opponent when you play it. That's going to be sweet. If you get one decent attack step in with it, then it's probably done its job. But just as a 4-mana Mind Rot that also makes your biggest creature really hard to deal with in combat, and this is a cool aura because it makes them a lot less likely to actually be able to kill the creature with the aura on it. So you have to discard 2 cards, right? So, as far as auras go, I'm still a little bit wary of it, especially given the 4 mana cost, but I gotta give it like a 2. I think it's a very good card. Or at least one you'll play. But moving on to Blight Breath Catablapa. Somebody told me that I'm supposed to pronounce it that way. As well as Cling to Dust and Discordant Piper. Both all good commons, or I guess 2 out of 3 are good commons. Blight Breath, BBC. Hilarious, right? BBC. Just being a 6-mana 3/2 isn't great, but the fact that this is going to snipe a creature pretty much every time it enters the battlefield makes it one of the strongest black commons in the entire set. I'll give this a 3. You'll probably play every copy that you get, even though it costs 6. Cling to Dust, actually pretty decent. You know, this is always going to at least sort of cycle, but it does have to have a card in the graveyard before it can actually cycle. But even that said, just 1 mana to cycle is decent, and then, you know, you can pump more mana into it later to draw more cards, so maybe this is a little bit better than I'll score it here, but honestly, again, it's still going to be worth the slot in your deck. Sometimes it won't be, so I'll just give this a 1.5, but I'm more than willing to be wrong about that. This could be a solid 2, but I kind of doubt it. Discordant Piper probably is a solid 2. This is 2 mana for a 2/1. That's at least okay, but the fact that it pays off any sort of, you know, sacrifice synergies or die strategies that you might have, and there is a minor, you know, red-black or a black-white sacrifice sort of theme in this deck, but again, or this set, but it's very, very minor. So it's going to be tough to actually make it pop off, but just a 2-mana 2/1 that leaves a body behind when it dies is always going to be at least somewhat playable, so I'll give this a 2. Now, moving on to Lampad of Death's Vigil, as well as Grim Physician and Funeral Rites. Lampad, I kind of like. You know, again, there's a minor sacrifice theme in this set at these, you know, in certain colors, and Lampad is one of the better lower rarity payoffs for that theme, especially if you can't find anything else to pay it off. You know, getting a couple of copies of this might actually be really sweet, and it's got decent stats to stay defensive as the game goes on, let you build your board state, all that. So, and 1 mana is not really that much to ask for triggering this ability or activating this ability. So, I'll give it a 2. I think that in certain decks it's going to be very good. Grim Physician, I really, really like this. Again, I don't usually like 1-drops in Seal, but this is precisely the kind of 1-drop I do like in this environment, because it's sometimes going to take out 2 and 3 drops when it blocks, and that is worth an awful lot on your 1-drop. So I like it. I'll give this a 2. I'm probably going to play it an awful lot. Funeral Rites, on the other hand, let me go ahead and pan over. Funeral Rites, on the other hand, is the Read the Bones variant this time around. These are always good, especially in slower or control-y decks. I've already talked about how sometimes getting your 3rd, 4th land is always good. This will make sure you get your 4th land and draw into gas, help you get to your bombs quicker. All that's awesome, and it fuels escape. This is one of the better Read the Bones variants we've seen in a while. That means it's very playable, and I'll give it a 2.5. I'll give it a 2.5. It's very good. Fruit of Tizerius, I'll just give like a 0-2 probably. It's not good. It's not a good card. Even in an aggressive deck, this is still probably not worth the slot. And you'd probably just rather play a creature. Trust me, it doesn't affect the board whatsoever. It can't snipe creatures or anything. You really probably don't want this in your deck. Even if you're very aggressive, just play a creature. Final Death, on the other hand. I scored it. I gave it a 0. Worst card we've looked at so far. But Final Death. 5 mana is a lot, but you do get instant speed here. The Exile Clause is very, very relevant. So I'll give this a 3.5. You'll play 1, if not 2 copies of this, if you get it. But when you see it, you'll definitely play it. One of the best, if not actually the best, common piece of removal in this color. So Final Death is very, very good. I'll give it a 3.5. Mire's Grasp, maybe the other best black common, honestly, in terms of removal. This is fantastic. I'll give this a 3.5 as well, just because you really can't get enough of this, you can't get enough of this kind of black removal, especially considering it triggers Constellation and blah, blah. Fantastic, especially with Hateful Eidolon, as is Mogus's Favor. This can be really good with Hateful Eidolon, whether you're putting it on your Eidolon or sticking it on one of your opponent's creatures, killing it and all that. So any kind of aura that can kill an opponent's creature is always going to be playable, but obviously this can make your own creatures bigger as well, can keep coming back. I really like this an awful lot. Even as far as auras go, I really like this card, so I'll give it a 3. I think it's more than playable in most decks. Nixborn Marauder, just a 4 mana 4/3, obviously not super exciting. It's this card. There's obviously a cycle of low impact, but yet devotion-based enchantment creatures. So you'll play it some of the time, but not all the time if you can't find something better in the 4-drop slot. I'll give it a 2. Well, actually, I'll give it a 1.5. We'll give it a 1.5. Omen of the Dead and Farika's Libation are next, though. And yeah, Farika's Libation does give black away to basically get rid of enchantments, but you're not going to get a whole lot of choice in this set. But it's still removal on a creature, too. You can just make it an Edict effect. It is instant speed. Even though 3 mana is a lot, it's still a removal spell, all things considered, so you're almost always going to play it. Great that it's at the common level, so you should see extra copies of this in some sealed pools. And you're probably going to play it almost every time. So I'm going to give this a 2.5. Actually give it a 3. It's a very playable card. Omen of the Dead I really like. It's one of the only omens that you have to have, something on the board to do before you can actually play it. A creature has to be in your yard, but still, a flash Raise Dead is kind of good enough by itself, especially considering it triggers enchantment synergies for a really cheap cost. And again, sacrificing it to scry 2 ain't half bad either. So I'm going to give this a 2.5. I really like the omens, if you haven't noticed. But moving on, we've got Underworld Charger, Temple Thief, and Soul Reaper of Mogus. Now, Underworld Charger, really great in aggressive decks specifically, but probably not good in any deck that's not trying to get super aggressive. But a 3-mana 3/3 is good stats. The fact that it comes back even bigger, amazing. So like control decks are going to have tough times dealing with this from aggressive decks. So I actually like this. Kind of a really good bid. I'll give it a 2.5. I think Charger is worth playing in a lot of your black decks. On to Temple Thief though. I don't think this is that great, but it's a bear. Again, it's a bear, so it's worth filling your curve out with it. And there are going to be some boards where this is effectively unblockable. So I'll give it a 2, sure. As far as like curve filling, bear kind of creatures go, you could do a lot worse than this. Soul Reaper of Mogus, really strong card again for the sacrifice-based synergies, but I worry that those are more of a draft thing than a sealed thing. I'm not sure how many, good payoffs you'll get in your sealed pool, but if you do, this is okay. Stats aren't great, but they're at least all right. Allows you to draw cards, sacrifice creatures that are going to die in combat anyway to draw cards. That's at least a decent mana sink. So I'll give it a 2. I think there's a lot of situations where you'll probably want to play Soul Reaper. Now, Scavenging Harpy and Rage Scarred Berserker are next. I kind of like both of these. Harpy is at least decent stats with a good evasive ability. You'll play it almost every time. Sometimes snipes an escape card. All that's at least a decent amount of value, so I'll give it a 2.5. Rage Scarred Berserker? Or maybe I just want to give Harpy a 2. We'll give it a 2.25. Rage Scarred Berserker, on the other hand, I will also give a 2.25 to. It's not quite a 2.5, obviously, but I do like the stats. 5 mana for a 5/4 is at least playable in and of itself. I'm not going to cry at those stats, especially at the common level. It's one of the biggest black common creatures. I think it might be the biggest black common creature, but still, it's bigger than a lot of other common creatures in the entire set. Green notwithstanding. So, not a bad play for 5 mana, all things considered, and the ability to pump creatures, give them indestructible. All that's actually kind of decent if you have something that you really want to get, a combat damage trigger off with or something. Then maybe, possibly this breaks stalemates and stuff, but the enter the battlefield trigger isn't huge. The creature, on the other hand, is. So I'll give this a 2.25. I think it's more than playable, but last black card is Venomous Hierophant. It's a 4-mana 3/3 Death Touch, so it's playable. It's playable. You really, really do want to be, able to get some escape stuff in your graveyard, or you want to be wanting to fuel escape for this to get the full value, but for the most part, I'll play a Hill Giant with Death Touch. That's a good filler creature, so I'll give it a 2. Moving on to the red cards here, and I do think red is pretty decent this time around too. We got Perforos, the the bronze blooded, that's hard to say, Ox of Agonis, and Phoenix of Ash. Dad Ash, to start things off here. Perforos, obviously crazy. I mean, most of the gods are, but you're not going to have a lot of ways to really get a whole lot of value out of the sneak attack activated ability on this. And 5 is, again, harder to pop off than you might think it is. So I don't like this as much as, say, Erebos. And I'd say it's probably on about the same level as a card like, Thassa, for instance. So I guess I just want to give this like a 3 or a 3.25 for now. Other creatures you control have haste as a decent ability, especially depending on how aggressive you are, how big your creatures are. But I just don't really see the sneak attack ability being great. That said, this is the highest statted god, and that might actually be worth a lot if you can turn it on. But Ox of Agonis, again, this is a card that I like much more in Constructed than I like in this environment. 5 mana for a 4/2 is actually kind of abysmal stats in Sealed, so I'm not a huge fan of that, but sometimes being able to draw 3 cards is obviously going to be absolutely ludicrous. That said, on the other hand, you're not going to have a whole lot of situations where you can escape this from your yard. 8 cards is an awful lot to ask in Sealed, so I mean, that's, what is that, a fifth of your deck or something? That's a lot. So it's 20% of your deck. I don't know how much I love it in this environment, but it can be a decently statted creature, I guess. But I can't really give it more than a 2 because it's just kind of a filler creature that sometimes gets you a tiny amount of card advantage. And when it does get you a huge amount of card advantage, it's amazing. But it's not going to do that in a lot of games. But I'll give it a 2. I'll give it a 2.5. I'll give it a 2.5, just because there are going to be situations where this does draw you 3 cards, in which case it's unbelievable. So, 2.5. Phoenix of Ash is great. A really great card. Three cards is not too much to ask to escape this. There's going to be some games you can escape it twice fairly easily, especially if you have a fairly high spell density. And just 3 mana for a 2/2 flying haste is good stats in and of itself. So I'll give this thing a 3.25. I'm starting off on the quarter grades here, but I don't want to give it a 3.5, but I will give it a 3.25. I think it's easily worth that. It's a pretty good threat that's evasive, and, can't go wrong with one of those, especially considering it comes back from the graveyard multiple times in a game some of the time. It looks like a very good creature. But moving on to Perforos's Intervention and Storm Herald. Now, Perforos's Intervention is just a removal spell 90% of the time, so you'll play it. You'll basically play this card every time that you get it, so I'll give it a 4 because it's a great removal spell, but if you're playing against control and you can actually resolve it, it's great. It's not dead against those control decks that don't present you with very many targets. You can still effectively just fireball their face off, so it looks good to me. Storm Herald is probably pretty bad. On stats alone, a 3 mana 3/2 haste could be worse. This could be playable in some sort of aggressive sealed deck or something, but it's mostly going to be stats alone. It's not going to be too often this actually procs, and if it does, you'll probably just get one aura, but that might be okay. That said, you got to exile the aura at the end of turn, so I'm not sure how much I love it. I'll just give it a 2.25. On next to Anax, as well as Underworld Breach, the Akroan War. I want to get Underworld Breach out of the way. I know it's in the middle of the screen, so that's awkward, but Underworld Breach does not look like a great card to me in Sealed. Sometimes it'll allow you to, effectively raise dead, get one thing out of your graveyard. And that's when it's at least okay. But at the same time, you can't like combo off like you can in Constructed with this. So I'll just give it like a 1.5 because I think there's some situations where if it just lets you play the best card in your yard, that's good. But it's not going to be great every time. Now, moving on to Anax, this is a good card right here. Sometimes it's going to be, 3, 4, 5 power, and that's a sweet attacker, but it's also great, I was going to say Wrath Protection. There are some Wraths to worry about in this format. So it's Wrath Protection, Spot Removal Protection, replaces itself when it dies. So there's a lot that I like about this, especially considering, if it dies, then suddenly you get 2 power. You get 2 creatures on the table. So it's just really aggressive. I like it a lot. Fills the table. Really good with the heroic creatures. Enchantment itself. Just I'll go on and on about how good this card is. I'll give it a 3.5. The Akroan War is freaking busted. I've always liked active treason style effects, especially in Sealed. I think they can be great in both sacrifice decks and particularly in aggressive decks. Active treasons are very good. But this is an active treason that also kind of wraths your opponent. And just like Constructed, in Sealed, that second chapter is what I'm talking about now. In Sealed, that second chapter isn't terrible, because if your opponent has a good attack on you, they're going to attack with everything anyway. So, you're either forcing them to do something they were going to do anyway, or you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do. So, it's fine one way or the other, but the fact that this is both, control magic for a couple of turns, and a Wrath effect is unbelievable. I'm going to give this card a 4. I think it's very good. Now, Tectonic Giant and Storm's Wrath, 2 of the best cards in the set for red, obviously. Now, neither one of them are particularly bombs. I don't know that I'd call them that. Although Storm's Wrath is pretty damn close, right? Being able to kill almost everything on the table in most situations is always good. I think it's funny, by the way, I just want to draw this comparison because I haven't yet. I think it's funny how many people assume you'll always draw a card off of the White Wrath, that your opponent will always get a card no matter what off the White Wrath. But simultaneously, people always say the Storm's Wrath is going to not kill 3 things. So it's funny. But anyway, Storm's Wrath is obviously a crazy card for limited. I'll give this a 4 because you're going to play it every single time. It's just going to, unless you're very aggressive and you've got a bunch of creatures this can kill, you're probably going to play a 4-mana Wrath. You probably just are. It's a very good card in Sealed. But Tectonic Giant, also a pretty good 4-drop here, obviously. It doesn't have the best stats in the world, but it's almost always going to produce some kind of a value for you. So I'll give this card a 3.5. I think it's worth playing almost every time you get it. If it effectively draws you a card or whatever at any point in the game, then it's done its job. So moving on to Blood Aspirant, Careless Celebrant, and Dream Shaper Shaman. Dream Shaper Shaman's bad. Can I just give this a 0? I'm just going to give this a 0 right now. I guess it's a 6-mana 5/4, so the body's okay. Triggers enchantment strategies. So let's bump it up to a 0.5. But I'm still probably not going to play it in my Sealed deck. Now, although, by the way, I do love the flavor text. Just this best flavor text on just about any Magic card ever. I love it. But anyway, Careless Celebrant, a card that I love. I really like this. You imagine how much this trades up. This can block like a 3 or 4 drop. and kill it almost every time. You know, you'll lose your Celebrant, whatever. You still traded way up. And I love that about it. I think it's a really, really good 2-drop and one that people are overlooking. It's one of the best red 2-drops in the set, if not one of the better 2-drops in the set, period. I really like Careless Celebrant, and I'll give this thing a 3. I think you're going to play it as more than filler a lot of the time. Blood Aspirant is obviously one of the best cards you can play in these sort of sacrifice deck, but again, I think it's more of a draft deck than a sealed deck. Although this can be at least somewhat decent, especially considering it synergizes with itself, I'm still not a huge fan of it, so I'll just give this a 1.5 for the sealed environment specifically. Just about every other environment, the card is better. Now, moving on, we've got Faithful Inn, Furious Rise, Heroes of the Revel. Faithful Inn, playable removal. Every single time, I'll give it a 3.5. You're going to play this in your deck. Actually, I'll give it a 3. That sounds a little better. It's got a baseline removal, and baseline removal is a 3, but remember, 3 is a very, very good score. So, moving on to Furious Rise. This, my preview card for this season, I do think it's actually a really, really sweet card, but it's very, very conditional, and obviously you cannot be sure that you'll have a creature power 4 or greater. That said, if you do, this is an outrageous card that triggers enchantment strategies and synergies when you play it, but also just gets you an extra card every turn, and that's very powerful and sealed. So if you can get it to pop off, I'd have to give this card like a 3, 3.5, because extra card every turn is dumb. But given that you won't proc it every turn, and when you do start procking it, your opponent is definitely incentivized to kill your 4-power guy right immediately. So to make sure you don't get this extra value. But if you are getting the extra value, the card's very good. But considering you're not always going to, I'll go ahead and give the card a 2.5, which is still a playable card, but you have to really build your deck around it. Now, Heroes of the Revel, we'll go ahead and pan over here to Heroes of the Revel, as well as Impending Doom and Skophos Maze Warden. Now, Heroes of the Revel, I think, is an awful lot of mana, but a 5-mana 4/4 is a decent rate. You also get another body off of it, and if you ever target it with anything, suddenly your entire team gets a bunch. And I've already talked about all the different cards that cards like this synergize with, and it's kind of an awful lot of them, right? So, Heroes, I can think, might be a really good red 5-drop for the very top of your curve, especially in aggressive decks. It could be kind of a bread and butter card. So big fan of this, but again, it's only for very specifically, aggressive decks that are trying to do this. So I'll just give it a 2.25. I'll give it a 2.25 for now. Impending Doom, I kind of don't really like, honestly. I gotta say. Unless you're being really tricky with this and you just want to bolt your opponent, stick it to one of their creatures and then kill it. I guess you could do that, but that's still only really worth the bolt to them. Sometimes that's not very good. Otherwise, it's an Oaken form that punishes you, and I'm also not a huge fan of that. So, I don't know. 3 mana for +3/+3 plus triggering aura and enchantment synergies and all that could be really good in an aggressive deck, but I still can't give this more than like a 1.75, which is what I'm sticking with. Skophos Maze Warden, a 4 mana 3/4 decent stats. It's almost never going to get the value off of, having a Labyrinth in play, but it can get through for 6 if it's unblocked, so it's got a really good threat of activation. And again, 4 mana is not bad for this stat line. I'll give the card a 2.25. We're doing it. Up next, we're going to Final Flare, Aspect of Manticore, and Arena Trickster. Now, Final Flare, Vegeta's finishing move, I guess it's Final Flash, but still. Final Flare is at least okay. I don't like having to sacrifice stuff, but at least it's removal that always kills something. Although you're kind of 2-for-1-ing yourself some of the time. I still think it's going to be worth playing, especially in some decks, and especially if you're trying to get value off of sacrificing things, which you might, here and there. Flare is probably worth playing, but I'm still just going to give this a 2. It's nowhere near as good as some other removal spells, but you'll play it if you're hard up for removal. Aspect of Manticore, I actually really, really, really like this a lot. The creature's only going to have first strike for 1 turn, but Flash is the name of the game here. Flashing this in to first strike something, you're kind of getting a more expensive Sure Strike that stays on forever. And Sure Strike is a very, very good combat trick. And just because this costs 1 extra, I don't think it makes it that much worse, honestly. I'm not a huge fan of 3-mana combat tricks. I don't want to hold up 3 mana in my aggressive deck very often, don't get me wrong. But I still think this is a great aura that if you can ambush somebody, it's just a freaking blowout. So this is also another sort of sideways way of making sure you don't get 2-for-1 when you play auras, because often you'll play this, kill something, keep your creature. So even if they kill your creature, you don't necessarily get 2-for-1 because when you played Aspect, you killed one of their creatures, you see. So I just like a lot about this. I'm not a huge fan of 3-mana combat tricks usually, but this is one of the few exceptions I'll make. I like this a lot. I'll give this a 2. Now, and by the way, that's a high score for a standard aura, for an aura. But anyway, moving on. Let's look at Arena Trickster here. This is a great card for this archetype. But again, I'm not sure how well you're going to get this archetype working outside of the draft environment. In Sealed, where you have much less control over your card pool, this card's not as good, but it's still pretty easy to envision a world where you've got a bunch of flash auras or just instants in general, and you can put 2 counters on this in a game, at which point it was very much worth the mana cost. I've talked before about how I think this archetype in draft specifically, but you could also say in Sealed, this archetype needs a card like this, one that provides more than just one-shot value. Oh, you played a spell on your opponent's turn. Cool, draw a card. Oh, you played a spell on your opponent's turn. Cool, do this, but it only lasts until end of turn. This lasts forever when you play a spell on your opponent's turn. And I think that that's exactly the kind of card that deck needed. I actually really like this. I'll give it a 2. Up next, though, we got Underworld Fire's Triumphant Surge. Underworld Fire's really a sideboard card, but a very good sideboard card against certain decks, but I really can't give it more than a 0.5. You'll almost never play this in your main deck. Now, Triumphant Surge, actually kind of like this, but again, your deck has to be very aggressive to actually make this, pop off. But if it is aggressive, you can actually utilize this card very, very well, and it's effectively removal on the, final chapter. And you're going to play removal almost every time you get it, even if you have to wait a few turns on it. It's still really good in aggressive decks. So I'll give this thing a 3. I actually think it's a pretty good Magic card, at least in this environment. Moving on, though, we got Flummox Cyclops, Hero of the Games, and Incendiary Oracle. Now, Red's commons don't look particularly great to me this time, and Flummox Cyclops is a good example of that. 4-mana 4/4 reach, decent stats right there, especially if you're going aggressive. A 4-mana 4/4 is good. But, sometimes it can't block, and it's weird that they gave it reach, but it also can't block sometimes. It's very awkward. But just based on stats alone, a 4-mana 4/4 is playable, so I'll give the card a 2.25. Again, I think an aggressive deck will almost always play it. You don't even care that it can't block sometimes because you weren't going to be blocking anyway. But Hero of the Games is just a 3-mana 3/2 with this heroic ability, and they're just really trying to make sure that you do have enough creatures to be able to do this with in Sealed. You'll always get at least a couple, not always, but you're likely to get at least 2 or 3 of these guys in your Sealed pool, so it should be fairly easy to put the deck together if you want to, but at the same time, 3 mana for a 3/2 is not usually my favorite stat line in the world. This dies to 2 drops. So I'm a little bit low on it. I'll just give it a 1.5. But again, if you're in the strategy specifically, it gets a little bit better. Incendiary Oracle, I really like this. 2 mana 2/2, so it's a bear, that's fine. They put a fire breathing ability on it to make it a little bit better, especially in the late game. And the fire breathing isn't super expensive compared to some other things. And it's sort of, occasionally will snipe again an escape card here and there. We see a few cards that do that. There's a lot of sort of built-in main deckable answers to escape, and that makes for a healthy environment. I actually think we're in for a really good Sealed environment this time around. They've designed it very well, and very powerfully, too. Incendiary Oracle is a good example of a 2-drop that does a lot of incidental work in the format while still being really main deckable. So I like it. I'm going to give the card a 2.25. On to Infuriate, Neurosis Blessing. Infuriate is a combat trick we're all familiar with at this point. Very good, obviously, with these heroic creatures, but I'll just give it a 1.5. Sometimes it can be a really good combat trick. Sometimes it's not particularly great, and it's almost never good outside of specifically aggressive decks. So I'll give it a 1.5. You'll play it in the decks that want it. Neurosis Blessing. This is good just because it kills something. You'll play it every single time, right? Like, you have to have... You don't necessarily... it's best to have a creature, right? Sometimes if you don't, this isn't going to be worth much. So I'm not a huge fan of the aura aspect of it, but at least it's 4 mana to kill a thing, and you'll probably play that just about every time you get it. So I got to give the card a 3. It's removal, right? But moving on to Portent of Betrayal. Again, I like these active treason effects, especially one that allows me to scry in a pretty aggressive deck. Scry can be a very good ability, so I like this. I'll give it a 2. It's somewhat playable, especially out of the sideboard. But Oread of Mountain's Blaze is a 2 mana 1/3, so it's decent, and it's got a mana sink that fuels escape and draws you cards in the late game. I kind of like this a lot, especially if you are in a more slow rolly kind of red deck and not so aggressive. This could be a pretty good drop, so I'll give it a 1.75. I think it's decent, maybe even a 2. Let's give it a 2. Omen of the Forge. One of the better red commons in the set, but obviously it's not going to go blowing up anything too big, but it's still removal that triggers enchantment synergies and lets you scry later. All those things are really good. Fuels escape in the late game because you put it in your yard. All that is still true. So just for having a removal spell that gives you so much incidental value, I got to give Omen of the Forge a 3 as well. This is a very playable card. On to Nixborn Brute and Irreverent Revelers. It's just always tough to say. Nixborn Brute, not impressed really at all. I don't like the 3 toughness on this. It is pretty ripe for enchantments and auras and whatnot, so keep that in mind. But I'm still not super impressed by it, especially even when compared to the other cards in this common cycle. I don't actually love it that much, so I'm just going to give this a 1. Irreverent Revelers, kind of just okay. You know, it's kind of a 3-mana 2/2 haste on most occasions, and I can't get really excited about that unless we're in a very aggressive deck. So I'm just going to give this a 1.5 as well. On to Satyr's Cunning, as well as Skophos Warleader and Stampede Rider. Now, Satyr's Cunning, probably not going to be the best card in the world, honestly. You know, unless you're trying to be really aggressive, but even then, I don't think it's that good. So I can't give this more than like a 0.5 in sealed. Skophos Warleader, on the other hand, I can, you know, get behind this, especially, again, if you need a sacrifice engine in these sort of sacrifice light sealed decks. It will probably be an archetype in the upcoming, you know, sealed environment. This is probably a very good card for you, but it doesn't really get your sacrifice engine online until well late into the game. But again, the, you know, threat of activation on this when it does swing in is incredible if you've got open mana. So I could see this being a very important threat in the late game, especially for the sacrifice decks. And I'll go ahead and give this a 2.25. I think it's very much worth playing. Stampede Rider is 3 mana for a 2/3 trample, which isn't the best stats, but it's at least okay, and it can get a little bit bigger. It looks like it could be a bread and butter common for, again, very aggressive decks, so I'm going to give it a 1.75. Let's go ahead and do that, but I don't think that it's particularly impressive in a lot of situations. Now, if you can, you know, always make it be a 3/4 for 3 mana, that's good, but most times it won't be. Thrill of Possibility and Underworld Ragehound, good cards. Thrill is particularly decent in this environment where it fuels escape or drops escape cards in the yard if you want to, as well as just drawing cards for you. That's always really good. But it also procs all these, you know, cast a spell on your opponent's turn things. So Thrill actually has a lot of pockets to fit into. It's not narrow at all, and even in the sealed environment. And I'm going to give it a 2 this time around. I think it's pretty playable. Underworld Ragehound is great. It's really good to me. I hate attacks each combat if able. That's not great. But in really aggressive decks, which again, Red is pretty able to do this time around, and usually, this is at least fairly statted and comes back at least once, if not twice in a game. It can be really tough to deal with, and that's pretty sweet. You know, it gets a lot bigger when it comes back, you know, the second time. Your opponent almost doesn't want to block it and kill it for fear of it coming back with 5 or 4 power. I mean, all of that is pretty decent. Nice little escape creature at the common level here. Most of the escape creatures at the common level in this set are all more than playable. Let me just put it that way, but I do like Ragehound in the aggressive decks. I'm going to go ahead and give this a 2.25. I think it's a nice card, but we only got one more red card to look at, and that's Wrap in Flames. Just 4 mana for this. I mean, this is... We've seen that a lot in red, actually, you know. Actually, almost all the colors have a take on a card they usually get. This is red's take on a card they usually get this time around, as well as a few other red cards, don't get me wrong. But this is a very sideboardable card, but I can't give it more than a 1. It's pretty decent out of the board, though. Now we're coming around the corner on this with green here. Let's take a look at Nylea, as well as Nyxbloomation and Erasta of the Endless Web. I do like Nylea a fair amount. There's going to be a lot of times, though, where this doesn't really make any of your creatures that much cheaper to cast, right? Like, you have to have bigger creatures than Nylea. You have to have them in your hand and all that. So, I don't know. Sometimes that passive is going to be just incidental and nothing else, but the ability to effectively draw cards off of this is going to be very good in the late game. I like it more than some of the other gods, but not as much as some of the other gods. It's kind of middle of the road. I'll give it a 3.25. Kind of in that area. But Nyxbloomation is so much mana. 7 mana is so freaking much. And when you do, you know, drop this, what else are you going to use the mana on? Like, unless you have an intervention in your hand, what are you going to do with the mana? So, you know, it's just a 5/5 trample in a lot of situations. And that's okay, but not for 7 mana. Particularly. So I'll just give the card like a 2.25. There, you might play it, but there's going to be a lot of situations where it might not even be worth it. But then again, I'm discounting how good a lot of mana is, right? So I'm going to give it a 2.25 because I'm still a little scared of it. Lots of mana is very good, but Erasta is just a 4 mana 3/5 reach, and you know what? That's a playable creature. That is a playable body right there in sealed. So I'm going to give the card a 3 straight away. Sometimes you'll get spiders off of it. If you even get one spider off of it, it's awesome. So, it really deprioritizes your opponent playing instants and combat tricks and stuff. I do like it for that reason, but it's fairly narrow in the application of giving you extra spiders. But just a 4-mana 3/5 reach is a great body, so I gotta give it a 3 off the rip. But anyway, Destiny Spinner as well as Dryad of the Elysian Grove are next. Both decent cards for constructed play, but nowhere near as good in the sealed environment. That said, Destiny Spinner might be a pretty good source of, creature, just being a creature factory in the late game, and it's got decent stats to start off with, so I'll give it a 2.75. Dryad of the Elysian Grove, again, much better in constructed, probably not going to have all the extra lands in the world to play with this, but this can at least fix your mana for you, and it's got great stats. A 3-mana 2/4 is at least decent stats too, so I have to give this like a 2.75 as well, just because the stats are there. It does have a decent passive, and it fixes your mana. I'll actually give it a 3. This is Dryad's still good in sealed. Moving on. After I coughed. This is the first time I've coughed all video. But anyway, First Ironian Games are next, along with Setessan Champion and Nalia's Intervention. Now, I really like First Ironian Games, or Heroian Games. I really like this a lot. Just creating the body that you can then put the tokens on and then fight something with. Like, oh, that's good. But very often, you're probably going to end up putting the 3+1/+1 counters on something else. You're likely to have a creature out to put the counters on. And then the fight ability, again, just like I was saying with the red 3-mana uncommon enchantment, it's removal, and you'll play removal just about every time. Plus, this makes creatures bigger. Like, I think this is kind of close to a bomb, honestly, and it fixes your mana, too, at the end of the saga. In case you don't know what a gold token is, I've had a lot of people ask me about that this season. It's basically a treasure token that doesn't tap. It's just an artifact token that you can sack for any color mana that you want. That's all gold is. It's just flavor because it's supposed to be like the Olympics. You get it? But still, I'll give this card like a 3.5. I think it's really, really good. But up next, let's look at Setessan Champion here. This, I also think is very good. There's going to be a high density of enchantments to play in this set, and very often you're still going to be able to play enchantments on like turn 4. Sometimes you can even double spell, Setessan Champion on turn 3, double enchantment on turn 4, you win the game. Kind of. It's just extreme value, so I think Champion, if you do get it, is just about as close to a bomb as you're going to get, without it being a real bomb. But if it does stay on the battlefield, it gets huge over the course of the game, and draws you a bunch of cards, so it's just unbelievable. I'll give this card a straight up 4. It's insane. But even, you got to have, other enchantments to proc it, but that really should not be hard. But on to Nalia's Intervention, I don't much care for it. Great sideboard card to get rid of flying creatures, but all in all, I don't think it's main deckable. I'll give the card a 1.5. Now, Nessian Boar, on the other hand, I think this might be the format for this card, because your opponent is going to have far fewer creatures in sealed in general than they are in a lot of games of Standard. Now again, if you're playing against like Control in Standard or something, Nessian Boar can get through for 10 almost every time if they don't have a removal spell for it. So, but in Sealed, your opponent is going to focus on playing creatures, don't get me wrong, but not as much as your standard aggro deck that plays a 1-drop on turn 1, 2 1-drops on turn 2, a 2-drop and a 1-drop on turn 3, all that. They don't fill the board nearly as quickly. So I think the Nessian Boar is going to be pretty likely to either get through or kill 3 guys. Now, you're going to make your opponent draw cards, and that's not great. I've got some, sort of ambivalent thoughts about this card. I'm a little bit on the fence, but I do think it's probably worth playing in Sealed, but it's one of the cards that I have the hardest time assigning a grade to in the entire set. So I want to abstain from doing so. That'd be kind of against the spirit of the video. I'll give it a 2 to start off. We'll see how it does in the environment. Mantle of the Wolf may be the best aura in the entire set. I shouldn't even put a maybe there. It almost certainly is the best aura in the entire set. 4 mana is a lot to get going, but +4/+4 is a freaking huge boost. And again, this puts 2/2/2s out if your opponent does die, so it kind of breaks the rules of auras, or at least what we're used to the rules of auras being. So just a really good aura. Make sure you don't get blown out when you go to play it on the creature in the first place, but as long as you can stick it to a creature, your opponent knows that even if they kill the creature, you're still getting value out of the aura. So just a really freaking good card here, and goes particularly well on a lot of different creatures that want auras put on them in this standard, or in this environment. I keep doing that. In the sealed environment. So I really like Mantle of the Wolf. I think it's an extremely powerful aura. I'll give this a 3.5. It's as close as an aura gets to being a bomb, honestly. But we'll move on to Chainweb Arachnir and Hydra's Growth and Colossus's Design. Chainweb Arachner, just a good sideboard card, but could be decent in the main deck as well, considering a 1-mana 1/2 reach isn't great stats, but this comes back as a much bigger creature. A 4/5 when it escapes is actually good enough to make me think it might be worth playing as an early chump blocker that becomes huge in the late game. So I'll give the card a 2.5. I think it might actually be that playable, but I'm not too sure. But usually the ability to kill a flyer is very desirable in Sealed, and this gives you a way to do it without having to make that card strictly a sideboard card, right? So I do like it as a threat that comes back and sometimes even kills something. In green, that's very desirable. 2.5. Hydra's Growth, another fairly close to being a bomb aura, especially if you can keep the creature out, right? The problem, though, is there's not really a ton of +1/+1 counter synergies in the Sealed environment. In Standard, there are some, but I don't think this card transcends to Standard whatsoever. Some people like it, not a big fan, even in constructed environments. This takes a few turns to really start snowballing, but if you're able to have this on a creature for like 3 turns, that creature is enormous after those 3 turns, and then any more turns than that, and it just becomes unbelievably big. Easily the biggest creature on the table, I would imagine. So I am a fan of Hydra's Growth in a way, but again, I'm also wary of it. This is a card I'm kind of on the fence about, but it is a powerful looking aura if you can stick it to the creature and then protect the creature from dying. Then the creature just gets huge over the course of 2 or 3 turns. So I do kind of like it, but I don't love it. But I do also want some more of it. So I'll give this thing a 2. That's a good score for an aura. You'll probably play the 1 copy if you get it. Klothys' design, I actually don't love. I really don't. This looks like the traditional, blow your opponent out, pump all your creatures thing, but it doesn't grant trample. And that I'm not a huge fan of, especially considering it costs 6 mana to cast. But sometimes it's going to give you creatures, +6/+6. You're getting 3 for 7 damage with your 1/1s, and that's going to win the game. So I'm not horribly wary of it. And I think this is going to be pretty decent at breaking stalemates in the late game. So I'll give it a 1.75. But I still think it's going to sit in your hand for the majority of the game doing nothing. And I'm a little bit, wary of that. So moving on to Mystic Repeal and Nessian Hornbeetle. Now, Nessian Hornbeetle, well, let's just do Mystic Repeal because, this is a great card, right? This is also, more or less unconditional removal, even against creatures in the Sealed environment. You'll play it. It's just 1 mana. You'll blow people out with this. Put their 4 or 5 mana thing on the bottom of their library for 1 mana at instant speed. Play it. This card gets a 3.5. It's that good. Nessian Hornbeetle, on the other hand, also another creature has to have a 4/4 out, but if you do, then it's a pretty decent value. And it's a 2 mana 2/2 in general, which is already playable. So you could do a lot worse in terms of a filler creature. I'll give this a 1.75. We'll do that. Setessan Petitioner, as well as Renata, Called to the Hunt, and Theros Beyond Brawler are all decent cards right here, y'all. Setessan Petitioner can obviously gain you a bunch of life, can lock aggro decks out of the game and all that. I really like this card, even in Sealed, where life gain isn't amazing, but this still gives you a body on the battlefield that gets you more pips for devotion when you play the next Pioneer. Or maybe to help, activate your Nylea if you got that as a bomb. Maybe make Renata's power bigger. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons you might want green devotion, but gaining a few life is actually a lot better on a body because it actually is life gain that affects the battlefield. I'm always going to like this. I'll give this card a 3.5. I think it's really that good. But Renata, Called to the Hunt, I think is also decent too. This gives you Metallic Mimic or, Great Hinge kind of ability where it just makes all your creatures that much bigger and does allow you to play with +1/+1 counter synergies, which is kind of nice. And sometimes this is going to be like a 6/3 or something. And that's all good. I think it's probably just barely worth the 4 mana, so I'll give it a 2.25. Theros Beyond Brawler, though, 6 mana is a lot. But just like I said with the BBC, the Black Common, even though this isn't a common, that does make a difference. But just like I said with that, a creature that kills something when it ETBs is invaluable, especially one that leaves you with a body this stout. That's always great. So it's not unconditional removal or anything, but it's very often going to kill a pretty annoying creature. At least a creature smaller than it, and that's worth a lot, especially in a color that doesn't have a lot of access to removal, and a fight effect that puts a body on the battlefield, that's just so good. So I've got this ranked really highly, even though 6 mana is a lot. I gotta give this card a 3.5. I think it's really good. But Nyx Herald is next, along with Nessian Wanderer. Nessian Wanderer is actually really good. If you can just play 2 or 3 enchantments over the course of a game after you play this on turn 2, suddenly you're getting a lot of card advantage. You're just drawing lands, but it's still card advantage, and making sure you hit those land drops is very important in Sealed. So I can even see a world where, like, if you don't have a third land drop, you play Nessian Wanderer on turn 2, and then on turn 3, you just play a 1 or 2 drop enchantment to try to hit your next land drop. Could be very, very much worth it. I like this card a lot, especially over long games. Winning the mana war is very important, even in sealed where games go relatively long. Having more mana than your opponent early in the game is very, very important, so you can get to your bombs first. So just fixing mana problems and putting a decent body for blocking on the battlefield is going to be decent. I like this card a lot. Like a lot. I'll give it a 3.5. Nyx Herald, also decent. 3 mana 2/3, not the best stats in the world, but it does trigger enchantment synergies. And it's always going to make a creature bigger and give it trample. That's especially important with some of these big creatures we see in this set that don't have the gift of trample. Nyx Herald can give it to them at a fairly low opportunity cost when it comes to, like, actually taking a slot up in your deck. So I'll give this a 2.5. I think it's worth playing. Now up next, we've got Binding of the Titans, Wolfwillow Haven, and Gift of Strength. None of these cards I like nearly as much as I do outside of, the sealed environment. When it comes to Gift of Strength, I think this is an incredible combat trick, all things considered. Maybe one of the cards I like the best of these 3 cards, because I like combat tricks. I especially like gaining reach as a combat trick. That could be really, really good in the sealed environment. So I will give this card like a 1.75. It's not bad at all. Wolfwillow Haven, probably way better in constructed formats, but at least it gives you a mana sink. It ramps you a little bit, and 2 mana ramp is good even in sealed, right? I mean, that's a good ability. So I can't really give the card more than a 2, but I'm not particularly excited about it outside of, standard. But in any case, Binding of the Titans, really good value here, especially if you're trying to fuel things like Escape. This can be really good. But for the most part, not a huge fan outside of the last ability on it. And that ability can be really, really decent in sealed, but you have to wait so many turns for it that I can't really give the card more than a 1.75. But moving on, we've got Inspiring Awe, Loathsome Chimera, and Moss Viper. I like all these too. Inspiring Awe isn't really great because I don't love fog effects. But if you do have a bunch, I mean a huge density of enchantment creatures, this can be a blowout. But I wouldn't necessarily think that it's worth it most of the time. I'm just going to give this card a 0.75. Not quite a 0.5, not quite a 1. I do think it's one of the worst green commons, but there are situations this could be good. Loathsome Chimera, on the other hand, I think is great. I think this is an amazing bread and butter green common. Not only is this a decently statted creature, even though I don't love low toughness, I do not love low toughness. This at least has the ability to come back, which somewhat mitigates the drawback of having such low toughness on a high-powered creature. But the best thing about this is that it's one of the best ways at a low mana cost to proc and trigger all of these cards that want you to have a creature with power 4 or greater. This is a great way to do it at the common level, and it keeps coming back, and that is really, really good. I like Chimera a lot for a common, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a 3. I think it's really good. I think it's like low-key very good. Moss Viper, on the other hand, I'm always going to love, 1 mana, 1/1 Death Touchers in sealed. If I do like a 1 mana creature in sealed, it's usually because it has Death Touch, and that's why I like Moss Viper. This can hold off 3 and 4 drops by itself and trade with 5 drops if they do ever deign to swing in. Play 1 mana, 1/1 Death Touches. Don't play 5 of them, but play 1 or 2 of them in a lot of your sealed decks. See if you don't like it. I like these creatures a lot. I'll give this a 2.25. Up next, we got Nexus Wardens and Nylea's Forerunner. Now, Nexus Wardens is just okay, but it's got a really good stat line. 1/4 isn't terrible for 3 mana, plus it's got the reach. That's going to block an awful lot of stuff. Shimmerwing, Chimera, all the way down. Any 3-power flyer this blocks, and there's a ton of those in sealed. So I do like the stat line on this, and the incidental life gain every now and then that might get you 4, 6, 8 life in a game. Also pretty decent, but I can't say I love the card. I will give it a 2.25. I think it's very good. Nylea's Forerunner. 5 mana, 5/3 trample, already at least okay, even though I'm not a huge fan of the toughness, but other creatures you control have trample is so good, especially considering this also triggers enchantment synergies. So it does so much. Fills out your curve in the common slot. I think it's a pretty like chef's kiss kind of card. As far as like when you're designing commons that are sealed playable, this is pretty decent, but I can't really give it more than a 2.25 because the toughness is so low. But the static ability on it, the passive ability is very, very good, and the stats aren't bad, so good card. But up next, We're looking at Relentless Pursuit, as well as Plummet and Omen of the Hunt. Now, I want to get Plummet out of the way. This is a 1.5. You'll almost never play it in your main deck, but it's going to be one of the best cards you have in your sideboard for games 2 and 3 in sealed at your pre-release. Now, Relentless Pursuit, on the other hand, I will go ahead and give a 2.5 to. I think this is supremely playable. It's almost always going to be a green divination that draws you 2 cards and at the same time, fuels escape strategies and stuff. And that's just never bad. So, yeah, I'm actually going to drop it a little bit. I'll give it a 2.25. We'll do that. Because I think the card is supremely playable. But Omen of the Hunt, again, omens are good. You know, this is maybe one of the worst omens in terms of like overall effect on the battlefield when you play it. But still, you know, flash ramp is good. Like instant speed ramp is decent. Fixes your mana, scries later, enchantment synergies, escape synergies, blah, blah, blah. I mean, all the same things that you've gotten tired of me saying about omens, they're all true about this. So I'll give the card a 2.25. Nixborn Colossus. 6 mana is a lot, but this is kind of the biggest body on a common in the entire set. So in some green decks, you're probably going to play it. And 3 devotion pips is very, very good too. So if you do have a Setessan Petitioner, or an Illyria in your deck, this can be good. But obviously not going to be one of the best cards in your deck. But it'll still win you a game every now and again just by being so big. So I'm going to give the card a 2. It's playable. Illyria's Huntmaster, on the other hand, incredibly playable. Another sort of payoff for playing green or playing devotion. You know, if you have a creature with trample, this can just come down and end the game for you on some board states. You know, if you've got 6 or 7 devotion to green and a trample creature, you probably win the game when you play this. But if you don't, you still have a 4 mana 4/3, and those are very good stats, all things considered. So I'm going to give the card a 2.5. I think it's very playable. But up next, we got Return to Nature, Setessan Skirmisher, and Setessan Training. Now, Return to Nature, again, sideboard card, but this can be main deck playable in this format, right? So, and the exile card from a graveyard is incidentally very good against Escape, too, so it just does a lot of work in this format. I think 1 copy is main deckable and will be creature removal some of the time. I'll give the card a 2.5. It's good. Setessan Skirmisher, on the other hand, great when it comes to, again, filling out your curve, but not incredible outside of that. So I'm just going to give this card a 1.5. Sometimes it's going to get a little bit bigger than it has any right to be, but not every turn. But again, decent bread and butter curve filler. As far as Setessan Training here, this decent, grants trample. I've already talked about how important that might be on occasion, but just drawing a card when you play it, pretty decent. Triggers enchantment strategies and stuff, aura synergies, so probably going to be worth playing a lot of the time. I'll give the card a 2. Skola Grove Dancer is a 2 mana 2/2, and that's okay. But the rest of the card isn't actually that good. It's really not. The mana sink isn't even that desirable. Even the incidental life gain isn't that great most of the time because it's not going to happen that often. Even if you activate it, it's not going to happen that often. So, not a huge fan. I'll give the card a 1. Voracious Typhon is 4 mana for a 4/4, and that's good enough. So I'll give the card a 3. I'm serious. I'll give the card a 3 because the stats are good, but when you escape it, it becomes even better, and it can escape. That's the thing, is a 4 mana 4/4 that they're forced to deal with, and when they do deal with it, it comes back a couple of turns later way bigger. That is a very good card, especially at the common level. I'm very surprised this isn't uncommon. And this might be another one of the best green commons. I'll give this a 3.25. It is very, very good. But moving on to the final green card, Warbriar Blessing. This is at least okay. Actually, it's more than okay. The fight effect on it is very, very good, obviously. It also gives the creature a little toughness boost to make sure it survives the fight. So like a 2-drop might be able to take down a 3-drop without dying in the fight, depending on what their power toughness levels are like. So that's very good. Just a green removal piece that also triggers these auras and enchantment synergies and constellation and all that. Always going to be very playable. Again, bread and butter at the common level here. So I'm talking myself into the card more and more. I'll give this a 2.75. I think it is that good. Great removal piece for green. Well, let's get to cleaning things up. We've only got gold, artifact, and land to look at, and there's really not much land to talk about. But let's talk about gold here with Ashiok and Calyx first. We're not really looking at Athreos here. It's the buy a box promo. You will not see it in sealed. But Ashiok is an enormous bomb. Ashiok is very, very good in sealed. Mark my words. This is going to be one of the better sealed cards in the set. Creature Factory is very good. It's very tough to deal with planeswalkers in this environment. It gives you value no matter what the board state is like. Decent when you're behind, very good when you're ahead, almost certainly going to win the game, and a great sort of control win condition if you're playing a sealed control deck. So I like just about everything about Ashiok. I'll give this a 4.5. I think it's awesome. But Calyx, on the other hand, shouldn't be too hard to actually make sure it pops off the right way, but you still have to have a whole lot of enchantments in your deck to actually get the real value off of it. Even in a 40-card deck in which that's playing 12 enchantments, it's still not going to hit every single time. So the best thing about this is the -3 ability and the ability to sometimes use that -3 more than once in a game. But again, it's incumbent upon the fact that you have enchantments out. And sometimes you're not guaranteed to, right? So there's some things I hate about this, especially considering that like people are going to be main decking enchantment removal. So if you tie an enchantment to that -3, it's going to be more likely that they actually kill it than it would be in most sealed environments in game 1. So I have problems with Calyx, but I still think it's a more than main deckable Planeswalker in a lot of situations. But again, you have to have so many enchantments that it's just barely not bomb territory. I'll give the card a 3.5. But moving on. We've got Klothys and Kroxa, two of the most powerful cards in the set for constructed play, no doubt, but how do they fare in sealed? Pretty freaking well. Turns out that Klothys is still reach in the mid and late game for, Gruul aggressive decks, and sometimes the deck doesn't even have to be that aggressive. You're just popping off 2 damage a turn, and there's really not much they can do about it, because they can't kill your indestructible guy. So, if it ever does pop off and you get the devotion to turn it on, then suddenly it's a huge indestructible guy that can swing in or whatever, but like you don't really care about that so long as it's popping off for 2 damage a turn, right? So that's one of the better things about the card, honestly. So I will give this also, I think, just barely off of bomb territory, just barely. So I'll give it a 3.5. Kroxa, I'll give a straight up 4.5 to. This is one of the bigger bombs in the entire set, just like the other Titan is, right? If you can ever escape this out of your yard, it becomes unfreaking believable. And honestly, 5 cards is just enough to make me think you'll be able to do it once in sealed. And in some sealed games, few and far between, but some sealed games, you'll be able to get it twice out of your graveyard. But even just the 1 escape on this is very, very good, because you'll very likely get your opponent to discard a total of at least 3 cards a game off of this. Sometimes they'll take at least 3, if not 9 damage off of this, worst case scenario for them. But they still have to deal with a 6/6 in one way or the other, and you made them discard cards. So it's going to be even harder for them to do that. So I just love Kroxa, whether it's standard or sealed that we're talking about. This is a very powerful bomb, and I'll give the card a 4.5. But moving on to Bronzehide Lion, as well as Atris and Allure of the Unknown. Now, Bronzehide Lion, everybody, is a 2-mana 3/3 that can get indestructible. I don't like pumping mana into it, but it is nice to have a mana sink like this that effectively keeps it from getting removed. And if it does get removed, it keeps another creature from getting removed a little bit later on down the line. All that's good. Very playable, solid card here for limited. I'll give it a 3. Atris kind of draws you 2 cards when it comes into play. That's always good, especially on a 3/2 menace. That's just incredible on a body, so I'll give this a 3.5. I think it's awesome. Just drawing a couple cards on a body, yes, we'll do that every time. But Allure of the Unknown, I don't love, because it's entirely possible your opponent, you find your bomb in those top 6 cards, and your opponent gets to play your bomb, and you feel really, really bad. I probably wouldn't play Allure. Even though it puts 5 cards in your hand, I very likely would not play Allure of the Unknown in my sealed deck. I'll give the card a 1 just in case it's okay. Up next, we got Polukranos and Iro, just 2 extremely high on raw power cards, both of which can be escaped, although it's a little bit harder to escape the Polukranos in sealed, but you'll probably get at least 1 escape per game off of it, and it just takes the game over. This fight stuff, it's a removal spell on a stick, a huge stick. It's more like a branch, the whole tree, so Polukranos is just a disgusting card that's going to end a lot of games of sealed. It's one of the bigger bombs in the set. I'll give it a 4.5. Same thing with Uro. I'll give this card a 4.5 as well, just because, again, you have to exile it or escape it to really get it on the battlefield. But in the meantime, it's drawing your cards, it's gaining life, it's ramping you. When you escape it, it does it again. When you attack, it does it again. Your opponent has to deal with a 6/6. It's just an unbelievable card. So even though it's kind of tough to put 5 cards in your yard in sealed, and it's going to be tough to get to it in the first place, I still think it's the kind of card that, late in a game of sealed, and this does look like the kind of environment that might go relatively late in a lot of games, this is just unbelievable if you can ever get it out of your yard. And even just the first time you play it and it goes to your yard, it's still freaking righteous. It's just a great spell. So I'm going to give it a 4.5 as well. But moving on to Dalekos. I'm just going to give this card like a 2.5 because the stats are good. But it doesn't really do much outside of have stats. So I really just give it a 2 because the stats are okay. But Dream Troller, on the other hand, I will give a 4.5 to, because it's maybe the actual biggest bomb in the set, except for maybe like Kiora Best of Sea God or something. But it's up there. It's in the conversation, in the top 3 or 5 biggest bombs you can possibly open in the sealed environment. If you do, it probably puts you in blue right real quick, kid, because this is just incredible once it's on the table, and it's probably going to end the game for you. There's not really much a whole lot of opponents are going to be able to do about that. So I'll give Dream Trawler a 4.5. It's about as close to the gold standard as it gets. Now, Enigmatic Incarnation is going to be really tough to make pop off. We've moved on here in case you didn't notice. We've got Enigmatic Incarnation as well as Gallia and Haktos on your screen, but all of these are kind of wonky, you know, like Enigmatic Incarnation might be hard to make pop off, but at the same time, you sacrifice like an enchantment, and you're going to be playing enchantments anyway to go tutor up the best creature in your deck at that cost. Yeah, it seems decent. That seems at least decent. So I'll give the card a 2.5 because this looks like, even like it could be a huge bomb. So it looks like it could be a 4, but it also looks like it could be a 0.5. So I'll kind of split the difference as much as possible. Give the card like a 2.25. But Gallia of the Endless Dance is at least a 2-mana 2/2 haste. That's going to be a little bit tough to make anything else happen with. But sometimes if you have like an Anax or some other thing that creates Satyr tokens, this can get way better, so keep that in mind. But this can also just draw 2 cards sometimes if you have like a land in your hand. So that can be good, but again, you're not always going to be attacking with 3 creatures in sealed. But the stats and the keyword ability are decent enough that I'll give it a 2.5. Now, Haktos is crazy. Another one of the best bombs in the set, period. If your opponent does have the exact thing they need to take it down, well, then I guess that sucks. But the chances are relatively slim that they are. So I'm just going to go ahead and give this a 4. If your opponent can block it, it's great. Then it's bad. But your opponent's very likely not going to be able to block it. So it's very good. Let's move on to Hero of the Nixborn, Eutropia the Twice Favorite, and Devourer of Memory. Now, Hero of Nixborn, probably my favorite. It might be my favorite of these 3. It's maybe one of the best of this heroic cycle. 3 mana for 3/3 in stats on 2 bodies. Very good. You know, expand your board state pretty well, and really pays you off when you cast a spell that targets it. So one of my favorite of this entire cycle of things with this heroic light ability on it. So I'll give it a 2.5. I think it's very playable in aggressive decks. Eutropia, the constellation on this is very good, especially when you get to the part that says the creature gains flying. That can be great, but this isn't going to break every stalemate in the world, right? But this can put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on a creature or distribute them amongst your team in the next couple of turns after you play it. This is another one where, just like Setessan Champion, you play this on turn 3 and then double enchantment on turn 4. That can be a really great turn, but that's not going to happen every time, and it's tough to engineer. So I'll give the card a 2.25. Very playable, but only in the right situation. Devourer of Memory, again, playable in the right situation, but usually just going to be a 2-mana 2/1, and I don't love it, to be honest, but there's going to be some long games, or just having the mana sink on this allows you to win the game, because you can go through unblocked every turn. You've got the board locked down otherwise, so in control decks, this might be at least a decent win condition at a relatively low cost that allows you to play it and hold up mana for counters and removal on the same turn that you've played it. So I do like Devourer in very specific decks, but I'm still just going to give it like a 2.5. That seems like a relatively high score, but I'm giving it a high score because I'm kind of thinking this might be low-key one of those cards that we're not paying much attention to, but ends up being a scourge in the limited environment at large, both draft and sealed, because it procs itself, goes through unblockable, ends games with some degree of inevitability, and inevitability is very important in sealed, and there's really not too many cards with a high degree of inevitability in this format. So I think Devourer of Memory might actually be really sweet, especially at such a low rarity. Keep it in mind. But we'll move on here to Acolyte of Affliction and Kuneros, Hound of Athreos. Acolyte is very good. Acolyte is very good. This is a Gravedigger, effectively, that gives you a better body than Gravedigger by 1 point of toughness, and also fuels those escape strategies. Helps you put something juicy in the yard to get back in your hand in the first place. Great to, say, blink with Thassa if you've got that out, or flicker with any other cards that flicker or blink or bounce things. Acolyte can be very good to repeat the center battlefield trigger, so just keep that in mind. I think this is one of the stronger uncommons in the set. I've always loved this particular kind of enter the battlefield trigger, a la Eternal Witness, for instance, and in sealed it can be very good, even if you can't do much with it if you don't have anything in your yard. By the time you get to play this, you'll very likely have a creature you want to bring back, and it's an amazing top deck. Do not underestimate this card. I'll give it a 3.25. Kuneros on stats alone, and the sort of keyword soup on it, the alphabet soup in terms of keywords, I got to give the card a 3.25. It's that strong, just on stats alone, but this is also going to randomly hose like escape stuff, so that's pretty good too. Let's move on to Mischievous Chimera. Maybe maybe one of the best cards for this archetype. If you are trying to like work on putting this archetype, if your card pool is conducive to it, then Mischievous Chimera is probably going to be the best card for that archetype. You know, 2-mana 2/2 flyer is good on stats alone, but the fact that this just does, 3, 4, 5 incidental damage for you over the course of the game and fixes your draws is unbelievable. But again, 2-mana 2/2 flyer is kind of playable on its own in sealed, so I'm doing it. This is a 2.75. Rise to Glory, also pretty decent. Sometimes won't be worth the 5 mana rate. Remember, 5 mana is an awful lot, but being able to return a creature to the battlefield is usually worth it. But again, I'm probably not going to play more than one copy of this in my sealed deck, if I do get more than one copy. But I'll give it like a 2 because it's playable. Siona, on the other hand, I'm not actually sure how incredible this is. You have to have a very high degree, a high density of auras to make this actually playable, and a 3-mana 2/2 is not great. So I'm just going to give this a 2 for now, but could surprise me. Obviously have 4 auras in your deck, it becomes way better. Slaughter Priest of Mogis, one of the best cards for the, red-black sacrifice archetype in Limited. Again, if you get this and a land pad and the 5-mana red common that lets you sacrifice stuff, you get all of them, you might be able to make that archetype pop off. But in general, I don't think that it's actually that worth it. Although I will say, if you're in a red-black aggro deck, even one that's not super focused on the sacrifice theme, this has a really good threat of activation, can get through for a bunch of damage all at one time if left unblocked. So it is a playable card, and it's decent on stats in terms of a filler creature. So I'll give it a solid 2, and that is a solid score. Staggering Insight here. I will go ahead and say, this is one of my favorite auras in the entire set, but it doesn't actually allow the creature to, it doesn't help the creature get through for combat damage. And that kind of bugs me. You want to put this on a creature that has flying, or trample, or menace, or some other sort of evasive ability. You put this on a Devourer of Memory, or off to the races. That seems very, very good, right? But that's a good combo. And it combos well with anything that wants an aura put on it. But I really wish that it helped the creature actually do the extra combat damage. But just +1/+1 and lifelink for 2 mana is outrageous in sealed. I said earlier that I like the 4-mana black aura that gives a creature lifelink, because lifelink is a very good ability in sealed. Helps you catch up in the late game. Really helps, makes it hard for you to keep up with. Because life swings are so good, in sealed specifically. And this is no different. 2 mana for just the lifelink is almost playable in and of itself. So I'll give this card 2.5. And last gold card here, we got Warden of the Chained. It's a 3-mana 4/4 trample. That's playable. It can't attack unless you have another 4-power guy. Shouldn't be too hard, but there will be times where you either can't attack with it, or your opponent at instant speed, removes your other 4-power guy before your attack step. This is left stranded, but at the very least, this will always block. It'll always trigger or help along any of those things that want you to have a creature power 4 or greater. It's good for that. So I kind of do like it, even if it can't attack, but I really can't give it more than like a 2.25, because it's going to be kind of tough to actually make pop off every time. But here we are, we've made our way into the artifacts here, and we're really rounding the corner. There's not much left to talk about here. Nyx Lotus, though, is decent. If you get it, play the copy of it. It's not going to be the best card in your deck some of the time, but there are other times it's going to tap for 4 mana, tap for 5 or 6 mana. It's very good, but I'm not really sure what you can do with a ton of mana in the sealed environment in this set. That said, those are famous last words. It's very easy to use your mana if you have a lot of mana. Once you're actually practically in that situation, you never get tired of having a lot of mana. So Nyx Lotus is probably at least playable. And if you do get it and play it, people will be like, ooh, Nyx Lotus. So do it. But I can't really give the card more than like a 2. But Shadow Spear is insane. Shadow Spear is so insane, everybody. Obviously, this is one of my top picks for Constructed from the set, but this is one of my top picks for Sealed. I already talked about how Staggering Insight gives a creature lifelink for 2 mana, and that aura can go away if the creature dies. This can't, and any deck can play it. Fairly cheap to make work. Hoses gods if your opponent managed to get lucky and open those in their sealed pools. So Shadow Spear is just unfreaking believable. You'll always find a creature to put it on, and your life will always be better as a result. I'm going to give this card a 4.5. It is very, very good. Entrancing Liar, actually kind of good too. It's kind of removal for decks that are hard up for removal. You don't have a whole lot of options in that category. And Entrancing Liar can be actually kind of decent. It switches targets as the game goes on. Any deck can play it. Doesn't contribute to devotion or anything. But that's not that much of a downside, to be honest. I mean, this is still a decent little pseudo removal piece. Now, I'm going to give it 2. It's not bad. But moving on, we've got Mirror Shield and Soul Guide Lantern. Mirror Shield can give your creatures Death Touch. It's pretty good. It's actually really sweet to be able to give your dudes hexproof at the uncommon level, especially considering there's so many like auras in this set. So I actually kind of like this card, but you have to have a very specific deck to actually make it work. So I'm just going to give it a 1.5. Soul Guide Lantern. You won't play it in your main deck. You won't. You probably won't even play it in your sideboard, even if your opponent has a deck full of escape cards. I'm still not sure how worth the slot it's going to end up being, but it might be. It might be. That said, I don't see too many situations where you actually bring this card in. You know, so I'm just gonna give it like a 0.5. Moving on though, got Traveler's Amulet, Thaumaturge is familiar, and Bronze Sword. Bronze Sword is not very exciting, honestly, but it could be good, especially if you have a bunch of flyers and stuff out. This can be at least okay, even with a relatively high equip cost, but I don't want to play too many copies of it, especially in a deck that's not very aggressive, so I'm just gonna give it a 1.5. Thaumaturge is familiar. It's okay. You know, 3-mana, 1/3 flying, not the best stats ever, but Scry 1 is at least alright. Any deck can play it, but doesn't contribute to devotion. There's some issues with it, but I'll give it a 1.5. I think it's playable if you need that last, 22nd, 23rd card. But Traveler's Amulet, I don't think it's going to do too much, but at the same time, this is it's almost a land drop. You know, like you can almost take a land out of your deck if you're playing at Traveler's Amulet, but not quite. So I'm not sure. Maybe if you're playing 3 colors, this is a really good way to fix your lands, but I've never been a huge fan of Amulet and Sealed. But anyway, moving on. Final artifact. We got Wings of Hubris right here. I love it. Giving a creature flying is great, especially at a relatively low cost to equip it. Once it's on the battlefield, equipping this for 1 mana is great. You put it on a 2/2 or 3/3 in the early game or mid game. Then late game, you play your bomb. It's a 5/5 without flying or something. Just give it flying for 1 mana. It's so good. That is so freaking good. I mean, sometimes if you just want to win the game, even if your opponent has flyers, they've caught up to you, sacrifice wings, suddenly, bam, you just win the game off of your unblockable guys. So I actually really like wings. I think it's definitely worth a 1 copy in most of your decks. Even if the deck isn't particularly aggressive, it's just kind of mid-range, this is actually a really sweet card, and I think it's one of the better artifacts, low-key, in the entire set. I'll give this a 2. I think it's very playable. But on to the lands here, which I can do without taking a break in between. These are good. Temples are good. Play the temples if you're in the colors and you get the temples. Labyrinth, it's pretty good. 4 mana is a lot, but it's a land that effectively removes a creature every turn. That's pretty decent. Field of Ruin, not great. Probably won't play it unless your opponent has Labyrinth of Scoffos, then you bring it in. Unknown Shores, play it if you're on 4 or more colors, but you probably shouldn't be on 4 or more colors in a devotion-based set. But that is pretty much it, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. We made it. How long is this? Actually, I don't know. I'm not recording on Audacity. I'm recording on FreeCam, so I won't know until I finish the video. But in any case, that is every single card in this entire set ranked for sealed play. Just let me know how you felt about it. I'm down there in the comment section. I am going to get something for my throat, like a lozenge of some kind. I can't even talk anymore. I've been talking so long. Either way, I hope you enjoyed it, even if you watched it in stages. I had a lot of fun making it, even if my voice is going to be out tomorrow. It's always a lot of fun to go through and rate every card. But if you did like it. It helps me out, puts me in more recommended feeds. Do all the YouTube stuff. Support content like this by going to the Patreon, link in the description. If you want to give me $1 a month because I'm crazy enough to do videos like this, then I would really, really appreciate it. Just check it out, and yeah. I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Good luck at your pre-releases. Good luck on Arena this season and Sealed. And I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.